just the welcome. Just welcome, take your seats.
No.
Yeah.
Liam and Lauren.
Welcoming to the stage, Lauren Harper Pope and Liam Kerr, co-founders of Welcome.
Welcome, everybody. If everyone can take your seats for us, please. All right, y'all are nice and quick to the seats. We love it. Welcome to the second WelcomeFest. Woo! So this is our second WelcomeFest, which is our annual public gathering, but it's actually our 10th community gathering. We started gathering in, we call it the basement of an office building in May 2023. And this is now like our 10th time getting together. We meet every 6 months and we try to build and cultivate community to make sure that the centrist faction of our party feels the vibrancy and the coherency and the community that it deserves to feel. So Liam and I, my co-founder, we started Welcome in 2019 ahead of the 2020 presidential primary. I live in South Carolina. Liam's based in the Boston, oh yeah, South Carolina, we like it. Liam's based in the Boston area. We're close to New Hampshire. And we were saying, hey, what can we do to make sure that everyone feels welcomed in the presidential primary electorate on the Democratic side, right? It's not necessarily anyone's job to reach out to people to say, hey, can you vote in this primary? Can you make sure your vote's heard? So that we can get a really representative sample of what the electorate wants in the Democratic Party. So none of our team lives in DC, right? We're all based all over the place. Our furthest away partner, Naomi, lives in Lauren Boebert's district in southwestern Colorado. So while we are not DC people, we love the people who have embraced us and welcomed us into this amazing community to make sure that we have the community, the support, the friendship that we need to do the work that we're all collectively doing together. We call the center-left ecosystem a family, an ecosystem, right? So that it's everyone working together. As you'll see on our poster, we have an amazing slew of co-hosts and co-partners for this event. And it's not just a welcome thing, it's an everybody thing to make sure that everyone knows that the Blue Dogs and Third Way and New Dems and New Deal leaders and the Next 50 and Inclusive Abundance and the States Forum and Dream for America and Future Caucus, we're all in this together with lots of other partners who aren't on that list to make sure, again, that the centrist faction has the muscles that it needs to build to win. So, that all said, I just want to take a few minutes take a second to recognize some special guests. So we have some really special former candidates, Rebecca Cook, Janelle Stelson, Adam Frisch in the building. If you guys are here, there you go, there's Adam. All people who have put their lives on hold, right, to do the work to be a public servant, right? And we have lots of candidates for 2026 here today as well. And so we're really excited to have all the 2026 energy here already. Thank you to all the candidates who've traveled from Florida and Michigan and everywhere else in between, California, to make sure that they know that they're running to ensure that Democrats are on the right side of public opinion. We care about you, we see you, and we can articulate back to you, to voters, what they are saying. So last year's theme was was for the people in the middle. So playing off of Harris's 2020 campaign, Kamala Harris for the people. So we're saying, hey, Harris, last year, let's make sure that we're for the people in the middle, where all the energy is. Adam's favorite line is, most people are in between the 240-yard lines on the football field, right? And they're not in the extremes, they're not in the end zones, right? So where can we meet America where they are and meet people where they are? And this year's theme, responsibility to win, because we're a party and it's our job to win, right? It's not our job to set the purity test. It's not our job to reject nuance. It's our job to win, to be able to build power and ensure that Democrats can have the power to lead and govern well. And so now with that, I'll hand it over to my co-founder, Liam. And again, thank you guys for being here.
Boop. Let's see here. All right. What does responsibility to win mean? how do we have that conversation? How do we do it as part of a community and one that takes action together? I went double. Boop. I'm protesting myself. Here we go. The first bucket we have of conversations today is around more red to blue. The second is less blue to red. And we've all seen in places where Democrats are in total control, more of what we thought were our voters are voting red, and many more are just moving to red states. And it's an important conversation. And then third, a sense of community that moves into action requires leaders who set a vision, who inspire people to follow them. And we are so grateful for those leaders that are going to be here today, setting sometimes adjacent visions to each other, but inspiring and clear and honest and authentic. And we're so excited to elevate them. In this first bucket, we're going to kick off with war, which Laksha will explain. Wins above replacement, the metric to capture candidate quality that we and so many others have found most effective. We'll talk about groups that win and other groups, and how to learn from overperformers. When we started, we said, who's overperformed the most? And we looked and we saw Joe Manchin, we saw Jared Golden, and we said, surely there must be conferences we can go to learn about this. There must be places where this most important of skills is honed and developed, like the other ecosystems in our political landscape. But unfortunately, we found that it wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just that there wasn't enough investment in supporting and replicating what was working in candidates who were winning, Trump voters who were winning in red districts. There was active harassment, sabotage. We love an argument. Arguments are good, arguments are healthy, and if we're ever going to have an argument as a party, it's probably right now, right? We think we can do some converting. There are people here who have been significant leaders in the progressive movement over the last decade who know that there is a more realistic path we have to travel for our party and our country. So, we've heard some chatter. People want to be disruptive as opposed to debating. And so we printed up some shirts. So we have an official protester shirt that we can do in exchange for some American dollars. And Brandon's going to come up and model this. Yeah, can we practice booing, actually? All right. There we go. Yeah, oh, that's good. Who said that? Can we do a USA here? Oh, yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, Brandon, we need to see that back one more time here. These are nice shirts. These are like kind of hipsterish, like you could actually see, All right. There we go. So on the back, we have the decision that we have to make. I am wearing a jersey of someone who stepped onto West Virginia's campus 50 years ago with a football scholarship, who is the #1 rated wins above replacement candidate in all of Laksha's database. And the choice is Jim Justice or Joe Manchin. That is the choice in West Virginia. There are local choices in other parts of the country, and we want people wearing the blue jersey. And we want people who protest or harass or demean and disrupt to know this is the choice. Blue, or you're delivering justice, Jim Justice and Baby Dog, to West Virginia. All right? That's the choice. Now, Brad, thank you for coming up again. I'm sorry. That was too much, man. And I got my Jared Golden koozie here as well. We're gonna have more swag for WelcomeFest 3, we promise. So, when we reached out and we said, where do you go to learn? Where do you learn how to do this? We need 5 more Jared Goldens. We need 5 more Joe Manchins. That is what we need. Where do we go learn to do this? The people we call are the people who do it. There are 12 candidates in 2024 who are in competitive Trump districts. These are districts Trump won by less than 10 points. Out of those 12, 7 of them are here today. We have learned so much from all of them. 2 others that were on our slate last cycle. We are so excited to have 18 candidates here who are running in 2026. Could those candidates stand up? Those candidates stand up. I just got some goosebumps. I mean, it is so important that we support in every way people that stop their whole lives, that sacrifice so deeply, that need to know how to do it. They want to know how to do it. They want that knowledge. They want that support. They want that community. And we need to go do it. We need to support them. And we need to stop the, people trying to do the opposite. There's a picture of Adam. Adam was the first candidate that we met when we first said, hey, why don't we look at these R+, a little more than others, districts. And that was really serendipity. Adam has joined our team, and for the last 6 months, we've been so lucky to have his son Felix with us as well. Everybody here is emailed with Felix, whether you know it or not. Yeah. Felix literally put his life on hold. Felix deferred college for a year. Adam deferred many other things, and their whole family. And that is what all these candidates are doing. And we're just trying to help make it a little easier for them and flip those districts. We're not going to win all of them, but we're going to grow this room, that's for sure. There you go. That's that attitude. I like it. But Lack's just going to say we're not going to win all of them. So I know we'll get the voice of God calling him up, but we are so excited to kick off with WAR, to go to groups, to learn from these overperformers. We have 3 new Dems that were in the top 5. The big ideas in the blue to red stopgap, New York, you guys probably heard of Abundance at some point, and then a vision moving forward. Blue Dogs, the data from David Shore, Senator Slotkin. We are so excited for today. Thank you all for being here. Let's go.
Welcoming to the stage, Split Ticket co-founder Laksha Jain.
Is it this one? Lauren, is it this one?
Yeah. It's got like a little hiccup that takes like a half second.
Okay, great. Cool. Hey everyone, my name is Laksha. I'm the co-founder of Split Ticket, an election analysis firm. I'm actually an engineer by trade. I don't work in politics full time, and it means that I process information very differently from the way that people in Washington, D.C. do, because I'm a machine learning engineer. My day job is working to optimize stuff in solar. So I'm also very politically involved, though, and when I hear people talk about candidate quality, to me, I don't know what they're talking about half the time. Oftentimes, they talk about, like, does this person agree with me on all the issues, or are they a reliable vote or reliable, voice in this allyship cause? And in this time of hyperpolarization, I think that overcomplicates it, and I think that this just contributes to the epidemic within the Democratic Party of not recognizing some of the most basic truths that are right there in front of us. And I propose a very simple definition of whether a candidate is good or not. Did they get more votes than expected? Right? Like, did they win or lose by more than they should have? And we can model how a race should have gone and compare it to how a race actually went with math. And I call the results of those estimates something called wins above replacement. For those of you that are baseball fans, you're probably familiar with this. A player that's 6 WAR, like Aaron Judge or Shohei Ohtani, 8 or 9, they do a lot better than a random minor league player you just drafted up onto your team. And there's no reason you can't extend this to politics. You can do a lot with math if you're just willing to. And so what we did was we created a baseline estimate of every single election and said, how did this election result actually go? And based on the results all over the nation, how should it have gone? We factor in things like partisanship, we factor in things like incumbency, whether or not a party even bothered spending money, the demographics of the district, and what the national environment was, right? In a red wave year, you probably expect to lose a neutral district. In a blue wave year, you would expect to win it handily. And so we control for all those things. And let me give you an example, I think a concrete example of what war is in practice, so we can all begin on the same page. Let's take two elections. One is New York's 14th, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez versus Tina Forte. And the second is Pennsylvania's 10th, Janelle Stelson, who's here today, and Scott Perry. So, right after the election on Twitter, I saw a lot of people saying, you know, AOC is the model of a strong Democrat. She outran Kamala Harris by 6 points. That's who we should learn from. And I was like, something's a little bit weird there, that doesn't add up. Because when I did the math, I found that that was a preposterous statement. And here's why. You may look at it and say, hey, AOC outran Harris by 6 and Stelson only outran Harris by 4. So doesn't that mean that AOC was a stronger candidate? And that's what the naive read of the data would give you. And this has caused immense problems in public discourse with the Democratic Party. This is where war comes in. This is what war solves. We control for all of these different factors that actually affect voter behavior, and we can assemble an actual independent and holistic estimate of how the candidate actually did. And how well should they have done versus how well did they actually do. In AOC's case, yeah, she outperformed Harris by 6, but she was the incumbent lawmaker in a seat that swung to the right by 24 points. It's way more Democratic down ballot. At that point, if you're overperforming Harris, you're doing it because you're getting a lot of Democrats for Trump to vote for you. And sure, that's great, but partisan loyalty always leaves last. Right? Like, these are people that are like, I'm a Democrat, but I kind of like Donald Trump, but I'm still a Democrat down ballot. I don't even know who Tina Forte is. I'm going to vote Democratic all the way down. Stelson, on the other hand, was challenging an incumbent in a seat that trended left. What that means is it's way more Republican down ballot. And for those of you familiar with Scott Perry's district and the geography there, you'll readily agree that it's much more Republican down ballot than it was for Trump. And so what war determines and what war shows us through math is AOC should have won by more than she did. She should have outperformed Harris by more. And Janelle Stelson should have actually lost by more. AOC's war was R+2. She did 2 points worse than expected. She should have won by 40, and she won by 38. Stelson's war was D+9. She did 9 points better than expected. She should have lost by 10 instead of by 1. And so if you're going to try to use candidate quality, if you're going to try to say things like, you know, who's the model for the Democratic Party moving forward on how to win elections? This seems like a really controversial idea on Twitter, but I suggest that the Democratic Party take lessons on how to win elections and how to win voters from people who have won more votes than most other Democrats would have. And so you may ask, like, cool, that's a great numerical exercise. Why is this relevant? And I'm here to tell you that numbers aren't just things that I find cool. They're actually incredibly revealing of some pretty crucial points for 2026. Challenger quality is an absolute game changer for the midterms. That's the difference between a 220 to 215 majority and a 230 to 205 majority. That's the difference between the red ripple last year that saw Republicans really underperform and the wave type of environment of 2018 where Democrats ended up picking up 235 seats. And 2026 is actually tracking, believe it or not, and I expect most of you will side with the not, believe it or not, 2026 is actually tracking by historical estimates for a D+5, D+6 type of year. Trump is unpopular, and Democrats turn out a lot. The one thing about our coalition being pretty neurotic in general is that we turn out a lot in elections. We know every election that's going to happen, and we make sure people know about it too. So we show up to vote. And 2024 was R+2. So that's 8 points to the left of what the presidential year was. And if we use numbers, if we use war, which is actually a really simple metric, we can leverage those insights to win. We can just identify super weak Republican incumbents in red seats who've never really run a strong race, who are vulnerable in blue waves, and all we have to do is run good challengers. I'm not talking about even running Joe Manchin. I'm talking about running just people that know how to talk to ordinary people. People who know that you're not trying to win over the activist group on X that retweets and posts 50 times a day. These are the people that instinctively know that the voter you are trying to win over is the soccer mom who isn't really as concerned with the election on Tuesday as she is with her kid's soccer semifinal on Saturday. Those are the people that good candidates can appeal to. And there's this other thing that I think is another epidemic in Democratic politics. We look at districts that are like Trump +3, Trump +4, whatever. We say they voted for Trump. Not happening. But shifts are always uniform. Something always happens. 2018 had Oklahoma's 5th district, South Carolina's 1st. 2020 had Donna Shalala lose in Florida's 27th. 2022 saw Alaska flip, and 2024 saw Biden plus 19 seats voting for Trump. And if you give up on fringe seats like Republicans sometimes do, you're going to lose them. I mean, take New Jersey's 9th, which is what I just talked about. If Republicans didn't run a QAnon nutcase, they probably could have flipped that seat. Instead, a Democrat holds it today. Trends are super unpredictable. Don't make the mistake of thinking that you can just extrapolate from the past, ad infinitum into the future. So we have to run good challengers everywhere, because if we do that, we can expand the battleground with data in a way that the other side just won't do. And let me show you an example. You guys might look at a Trump +15 seat, and you may think, oh, that's not winnable. They voted for Trump by a lot. Well, keep in mind, if 2026 is tracking to be a D+6 seat, that's 8 points to the left of 2024. That means the nation swings 8 points to the left. If you swung that seat 8 points to the left, you would get an R+7 seat. And you may say, hey, well, that's still an R+7 seat. That's really tough. Guess what? Ruben Gallego and Kari Lake, that's the type of matchup that would flip an R+7 seat. That's the type of matchup that did flip Trump +5 Arizona. If you replicate that type of overperformance in 2026 in a Trump +15 seat, you could win. And so we can use war to identify a lot of hidden targets. We can use war to find candidates who won by a lot in 2024, and so they think they're safe, but really they just face mediocre challengers in a tough year. And so war lets us find this really easily. And for the last 5 minutes, I just proposed a very simple exercise. Let's just take a look at all incumbents with an average WAR of R+2 or less. So it means they're not really anything special. They're not electoral titans or anything like that. And let's look at likely or safe R seats. So these are seats that Republicans think they've got on lock. And I want to show you what happens if we run good challengers in those seats. Like the Welcome Pack, see, Lauren and Liam are great at recruiting really, really good challengers. And I actually calculated their average challenger WAR in 2024 was actually D+4. So that's immense, because let me show you what happens in this exercise. If we just ran all of their types of guys in these seats, this is what will happen, okay? And I want to keep in mind one thing. We're not going to win all or even most of these seats because, again, they're pretty red, it's pretty tough, and running a good challenger is actually surprisingly hard. Good people nowadays have an aversion to public office because why would you put yourself front and center in front of the most neurotic and insane people that the planet knows? But occasionally there come along some good public servants who really just have it in them to do the best for the party even at the cost of their own personal lives. And the best for the country. So that creates openings for upsets, and something always happens. That's literally what I tell everyone. Something always happens. We're going to take 2024, we're going to adjust it to be what 2026 is tracking to be, and we'll adjust for incumbency. And let me show you the targets that start coming up. You have people that have never been on the radar in the last 6, 7 years. Ann Wagner in Missouri, that's rated safe Republican. That's a seat that if we ran a good challenger, actually, you know what? We might very well just win that outright. Take Virginia's first with Rob Whitman. That's a seat nobody has on their radar. But that's a seat that we could actually win by a pretty sizable margin if we run a good candidate. Okay? Chuck Edwards in North Carolina, Ashley Hinson in Iowa, Max Miller in Ohio, Corey Mills in Florida. These are the types of people that can actually face really, really tough races. What we have to do is we have to be smart about it. They could face tough races. It doesn't mean that they will. If we run candidates who don't know how to talk to the other side, being very blunt, if we run candidates that DC finds appealing, we're probably going to lose. There's an inverse correlation between what you guys all find appealing and what the median voter finds appealing. And as long as we recognize that, because look, a lot of you may say you find some of Jared Golden's votes to be annoying for a Democrat. Well, guess what? The choice isn't between Jared Golden and AOC. The choice is between Jared Golden and Paul LePage. So who would you rather have? And the choice is very clear because the blue dogs, the moderate caucuses, tend to overperform the most. So pick people in that vein. Pick people who know how to talk to the other side, because the most controversial idea in politics continues to be that people have beliefs that they hold dear and true and vote according to those beliefs. You're not going to get, conservatives in rural Iowa to back Moms for Everytown. It just doesn't happen. They're speaking two different languages. They're in two different worlds. If you ran progressives, you're going to start with a 5-point disadvantage in a lot of these seats compared to a blue dog, and that makes running and flipping seats like Corey Mills' seat off the radar completely. And here's the other thing, right? Race and gender do not matter. They just don't. We've spent so much ink on whether or not people lose because they're a woman or lose because they're black. And what that means is we just take people in general who are talented candidates and blame them for the shortcomings of the Democratic Party. They didn't lose because they were black. They didn't lose because they were a woman. Women did better than men in 2024 in battlegrounds. Okay? Minority candidates also did slightly better than white candidates. Electability doesn't mean white dude. If you over-index on race or gender, you're missing the point that voters don't care about that stuff as much. Voters want candidates they can relate to. They want candidates they can talk to. They don't care about whether you're white, black, gay, straight, whatever. And so I close by just saying, for the rest of today, if we can take one lesson, you don't need to learn from me. Learn from the people who did well in elections, okay? We have 7 of the best performers here today. Rebecca Cook, Adam Gray, Janelle Stelson, Marie Glusenkamp-Perez, Jared Golden, Adam Frisch, Kristen McDonald-Rivet. Don't learn from an ML engineer, guys. Learn from these people. These people know instinctively what the data says. If you listen to them, if you just listen to them, you'd come away with the same understanding that 2,000 hours of data modeling have led me to. So save yourself the time. Just to close, right? Wins are really possible. We can do a lot of great things. We can win elections, we can restore balance back to Washington, but it requires dedication, it requires a commitment to winning. And it requires us to embrace rather than run away from conflict. Being yelled at on Blue Sky is good. Okay, I'm probably main character number 1 on the days when I publish a graph where I say that moderates do better, but you know what, it's true. The base will vote for you anyways. Don't worry about liberal defections. You will win the liberal vote if you get out of the primary. And voters aren't the same as these hyper-engaged posters. Like I tell people, you're not fighting fascism, you're posting on your phone. If you want to fight fascism, go and win elections. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Welcoming to the stage, Matthew Iglesias.
See who's the main character on Blue Sky. It's a lot. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to get these slides. Okay, yeah. So the question is like, why do Democrats make bad decisions? There are many reasons. But these are some things that people have told me over the past 5 years, talking to staffers who work for the top people in the Democratic Party. Just a few kind of illustrative examples. Does this thing work? Okay, so why didn't permitting reform get done? The enviros killed it. That is what happened. I was speaking to Schumer staffers early in the Biden administration. I'm asking, would Democrats be open to standalone immigration bills? And they told me, well, it depends what the groups think. And why? Is that a good way? Is that a good way to think about issues? No. So early also in the Biden administration, they were taking a lot of heat from Republicans who were saying, there's this crisis at the border, and people from the White House reached out to me. They wanted me to try to explain to the public that these day one executive orders that the president issued weren't actually responsible for the crisis that was happening. And so I asked them, okay, fair enough, but why did you issue those orders? And they said, well, we wanted to throw the advocates a bone. Why wasn't there a crime plan from the Biden administration while crime was soaring? Well, they worked on it. They tried to put some things together, but we had to clear it with the criminal justice reform advocates first, so they couldn't quite come up with anything that really worked. This one, I think, in some ways was the worst. I asked the question because there had been reported, I think, a lot in the international press that sanctions enforcement, they were trying to balance, the economic harms of higher oil prices with the foreign policy benefits of tighter sanctions on Russia, Iran, Venezuela. At the same time, though, they were raising drilling fees on domestic oil and gas. And I was talking to someone who worked on economic policy. He said, it's true, this isn't completely coherent, but climate groups don't lobby on sanctions. So we gave them something domestically rather than internationally. It's really irresponsible way to do things. This generates a lot of very substantive policy vulnerabilities that we have across here. We had prolonged school closures during COVID. We had paralysis on the women's sports issues. We have late-term, candidates running on late-term abortions in red states. We have refusal to discuss record oil and gas production that happened in the United States. And this is also bad substantive policy, to be clear. I mean, it's not just a question of being opportunistic. Biden was genuinely slow to act on the border. They didn't really do anything on the inflation cost of living crisis. The cost of living in blue states is higher than in red states. This is a shout out to the abundance people. And Democrats have been really behind the curve on a lot of basic educational stuff about phonics. You've probably now all seen, everybody's done the article about how does Mississippi wind up with better reading results than Maryland. And it is excessive deference to different interest group coalitions. It also leads to a lot of policies that even the Democrats who support them don't seem to really care that much about. You never meet the person who's fuck yeah, we banned plastic straws. And yet they sort of robotically do it because these things get asked. And nobody knows, land acknowledgements. Nobody wants this, and yet it happens. You also have these interest groups, their main mode of action is to generate bad press for Democrats. Laksha was talking about the value of strong candidates. A lot of progressive work goes into trying to make these candidates look bad for no real reason. They also create bad information for Democrats. The sort of main theory of action that a lot of these left advocacy groups have is they put out polling that isn't correct, right? I mean, we all know you can manipulate through question wording, sort of get what you want. And so everybody says, oh, like our issue is super popular. This one is Jay Inslee trying to tell people that we can win back young voters by talking about climate change, when like we just ran this experiment. We had the first administration ever that made climate their top priority. Democrats did terribly with young voters, much worse than they had in the past. It also creates bad incentives. You know, I was talking to people, I said, you know, everybody knows that immigration is kind of Trump's strongest issue. Why do you have so many people making bad press on this? And say, well, you know, these guys, they're from safe seats, so, you know, they do it, people like it. It's important to understand that, you know, this is not a question of the most fringy kind of groups. There are like really crazy people like climate defiance and stuff like that, but they are not in the driver's seat, right? These problems here are being caused by fairly mainstream groups that have real meaningful clout in the Democratic Party, major green organizations, labor unions, things like that. Similarly, the problem isn't really the far left members. You often kind of get together at a gathering of pragmatic or moderate Democrats, and you hear a lot of like rage about Ilhan Omar and so on and so forth. But you know, every caucus has extreme members. You can underperform in a safe blue seat, and it's not a big deal. And the factional strategy that they are executing actually makes sense. The problem that we are wrestling with is that it's the mainstream Democrats, you know, who are seen as too left-wing. And so this leads into a question where you get too much of what I've started to call dog whistle moderation, where people will come up and say, oh, like we shouldn't be so woke, or they're picking random fights with Bernie Sanders and the squad, when it's the national image of the Democratic Party that is really the issue here. You know, like voters think that mainstream Democrats are too far left. And not that the most left-wing Democrats are too far left, but that the ones in the mainstream of the party are too far left. And this is very heavily driven by what these large mainstream advocacy groups who have a lot of influence over primaries, have a lot of influence over the upward mobility for people are. So I think, you know, individual members of Congress just sort of need to search their own heart, find something. You never meet a real person who is as dogmatic as like a typical member of Congress. You know, if you go out there, it used to be that you would meet people all the time in politics who sort of privately had certain very progressive views that they were swallowing for electoral reasons. I now more and more often meet the opposite. You know, people who have 3 or 4 things that they're like secretly moderate on, but they don't want to say that because they don't want to get yelled at. They don't want to face blowback from donors. They don't want to face impediments to, you know, running from statewide office, something else like that. But if you want to be, you know, better liked, you want to be authentic, but like search your heart. Don't pretend to be more dogmatic than you really are. And the party as a whole has to be more open to heterodoxy and differences of opinion across these different things. I've seen a million kind of post-election roundtables about you know, podcasts and influencers and all these kinds of things. But you have to understand that when you develop an ideological infrastructure where to be considered kosher, you have to be, you know, orthodox on this incredibly long laundry list of policy things, well then of course somebody who's not as into politics is going to gravitate to the other side. So, you know, it's a great idea to fund these kind of groups if your view is that Trump is like fine and there's no problem with running the risk of losing seats. But, you know, don't fund them if you seriously think that Trump is bad, that he's a threat to democracy, that rolling back the social safety net and abortion rights is bad. So, you know, it's as simple as that. Can we fund something useful instead? Yes. You know, real policy development is always needed. It is actually hard to govern the country well. We sometimes treat that as trivial, like just win elections. But people need good ideas that will work and will solve problems. Accurate public opinion research is really good. To show my progressive bona fides, I put a Lenin quote in, better, fewer, but better. But it's a little bit of a fallacy, I think. A lot of times people want to say, well, if we just kind of like invest more in this topic area, we can make more progress. That's not really true. You need to fund things that are smart. You need to fund people who are really capable, and not just assume that by piling on more and more and more, you're going to accomplish what you need. So that's what I got to say, and I'll turn it over to Lene.
Welcoming to the stage, Lene Erickson, Laksha Jain, and Adam Gentleson.
I wasn't asked what walk-up music I wanted, so next time, that's in my speaker briefing. It's so nice to be here with a friendly audience. I feel like I could just +1 to everything else I just heard. But we also want to talk about what we do about some of these issues and how we win. How do we create and build an infrastructure of people who are focused not on purity, but on winning, so that we can make sustainable progress on the things we all really care about. So excited to talk about that with y'all today. We all know, and we've seen a little bit in the first two conversations, about the real infrastructure the left has built up. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a huge amount of investment in places like Justice Dems, Our Revolution, a lot of resistancy people that are doing resistancy things. And they've had a lot of energy and a lot of activity and a lot of coverage in the press. But what they haven't done is done a lot of winning. And winning is what we're trying to do here. So when you add together every single seat that Justice Democrats or Our Revolution has flipped from red to blue in the entirety of the Trump era, you get a map of 0. Exactly 0 seats that have been flipped. So I think we need to do better than that. I'm going for beyond 0. This is the number of seats they've flipped. We've got a lot more than that on the moderate side, but we need even more. And one thing they have had impact on is the Democratic brand. The thing that has been really most damaging about the impact of these groups is that, as we were talking about, they now define what a mainstream Democrat is. And we had one really shocking question in our poll that we asked post-election to say, which party is more extreme? The party of Donald Trump and his craziness and fascism and anti-democratic things and all of the wacky things that he's doing, or the Democratic Party? Well, it turns out that voters actually thought we were more extreme. When you ask them to map the ideology of the parties and where they put themselves, where they put Trump and where they put Harris, they put themselves much closer to Donald Trump than our nominee. This is a problem we need to solve. And it's not a problem we solve by making people stop saying stupid things. As Matt Iglesias said, people are always going to be out there saying stupid things. Members, groups, they're going to say things, but we have to figure out what we in this room can do in order to change that brand, and I think that's by us being louder. So that's what we need to talk about today, is how do we do what's in what I like to call our circle of influence around this, and that is by talking more and being ready to go bat to bat with people who we disagree with and not talking less. So I want to talk about that and how we do that with the couple of people I've got here on stage. I think there's opportunities, even in the slides that you already presented today, there's opportunities, there's potential solutions, but we got to meet the scale of the problem where it's at right now. So Laksha and his team have showed that moderate candidates outperform extreme candidates. You're also an entrepreneur who started a really important part of this center-left infrastructure and election analysis, and now you're opining at the Washington Post. So opine to us, tell us, what do you see missing in this infrastructure that folks in this room can fund, start, and go do in order to change this dynamic?
So I think the one thing that's missing broadly from Democratic politics is normalness. And I'll explain what we can do about that, because see, Matt's correct. People are always going to be out there saying crazy things, and it's up to us as to what choices we make. I think the first thing is that the left has done a really good job at setting up an infrastructure for their candidates in the primaries and for making sure that people believe that in order to get through the primaries, they have to adopt those stances. And the truth is, they don't need to necessarily. But the candidates that can win these races in tough seats, that actually have the ability to talk to Trump voters, sometimes they just run into the problem of they don't have enough money, so they need to start saying things to get endorsements, to get alignment, alliances, and money in general. And so if there was one thing that was missing from the Democratic infrastructure, it's giving these people the opportunity to raise enough money to be competitive in statewide and district-wide primaries so that they can say whatever they want and be empowered to not necessarily hew to any ideological line, because that's what damages them a lot. Because in this process, they start taking stances that they may not necessarily believe. So firstly, it's even less effective that way. And then also, they feel like they have to do it because otherwise they're going to face an intra-party war. And giving them that intra-party backing is the most critical thing, in my opinion.
Adam, you, I'm sure, got a lot of love on Blue Sky for your New York Times piece, When Will Democrats Learn to Say No to the Groups? So you know just how fun it is online. And you are also a former Senate Chief of Staff, and so you've encountered this kind of day by day as the groups have tried to influence folks on the Hill and candidates. What do you think we need to focus on to stop this pressuring of candidates to take these positions that are often substantively bad, but definitely politically toxic?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things, and some of them have been discussed. I mean, I think idea generation is really important. Third Way does an amazing job of that. I think advocacy on the Hill is really important. If you're working in a Hill office, most of what your legislative staff does all day is take meetings with the groups who show up to every meeting carrying a poll that shows that whatever position they're pushing you to take is quote unquote popular. And so increasing the amount of intellectually honest opinion research that's out in the world and that members have access to is really important, because a lot of time what that experience is you're sitting on the table on the other side from these groups and you're like, that doesn't seem right to me, that this extreme position you're telling me to take polls at 55%, and they won't show you the 10 different ways they worded the question to get that answer. All that stays in the file drawer. But you also don't have, as the person on the other side of the table, you don't have the information to know that it's wrong. And so you're sort of captive to what they're showing you. So increasing the quantity and quality of public opinion data that's out there on some of these tough issues is really important. And I also would just say, something everybody can do for free is just to speak up more on social media, because it remains a pretty trying experience in the world to say the types of things that we're saying here in public. You get people piling on you on Blue Sky, on Twitter, and for someone I've been through it, it doesn't really affect me. But if you are, a member of Congress and you look at your clips the next day, and it's a lot of negative stuff, and as Matt just pointed out in the last presentation, the groups are highly effective at generating negative press. It's something they can do pretty easily and doesn't cost a lot of money to do. So it's still a kind of a miserable experience. And I think what is missing is the countervailing voices, people cheering people on who are saying things that we want them to be saying. So I would say, there's a lot of sort of structural things that need to be built. And I think it's exciting to be at a place like this with people like you guys who are building those things. But just the daily act of using your voice to support people who are saying the kind of stuff we want to see candidates saying is something that everybody can do, and that you'd be surprised. You might find your tweets ending up in the clips package of that member of Congress the next day when they're reading it. Like, this stuff actually does matter, and it's a counterweight to what they're getting from the other side.
I love that specific example. As somebody who has also been ravaged online for many things, I often get a lot of very quiet, I agree with you. And a lot
say it out loud.
Yeah, say it out loud. That's what we're trying to do here. Is there any example of a moment when you've been in that, Twitter or Blue Sky craziness, that somebody did something that was effective and made you feel like, oh, I'm doing the right thing, or was like a good counterweight? Because those moments are hard.
Well, what was interesting is seeing how the backlash that happens online is actually the sign that you're doing something right. And I think part of what is difficult for many candidates and members of Congress to do is to sort of push through that first 24, 48 hours of the shitstorm and stick with it until they actually start to get the benefits. Because something that I've experienced in the last couple of years is that, there's a sort of macro effect of voters observing the far left activists in your party get mad at you or get mad at your boss or your candidate, and then voters see that and say, oh, that is a positive to me. I see it as a positive that this person is saying something that is getting them yelled at by the far left activists, because that must mean that they're saying something normal. And it demonstrates that they have the independence of mind and the independent thought to speak out for themselves and to not follow the rigid ideology of their party. So I think that, if you find yourself in this situation, the very fact that you're getting this response means you're doing something right. And if you're working for a group or you're staffing a member or an office, my advice is just to keep pushing through it, because I think eventually you will see that there's that knock-on benefit of demonstrating for free, right, purely through earned media, that your candidate is a different kind of Democrat or is willing to speak out and speak independently and have that independence of mind.
So, Laksha, let's turn back to you. We love winning, and you love winning. It's good. We're going to do it. What advice do you have for more center-left pragmatic people who are running in a Democratic primary for how they get through to be that winning candidate so that we can win in the general? Have you seen from the data or from all of your extensive election analysis some tips and tricks that folks can take so that they can get to that next step?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is that people vastly overestimate how ideological these decisions are in the primary. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're a mayor, okay? You're a center-left mayor and you're running for the nomination in your seat. And you're well-known and you have a good profile. Okay, regardless of whether or not the groups like you, you're a definite favorite to win that primary. And what happens is that because people can be loud and people can be annoying, we lose sight of the fact that all votes are equal, okay? Whether you win the vote as someone who's very quiet about it or whether you win the vote as someone who's very loud about it, you get one vote. But it's a lot more pleasant to win the vote as someone who's very loud about it, because then you don't get harassed. The thing is, to get through these primaries, you don't have to say half of these things that you think you need to say. The Democratic voters are much more understanding than you believe. We don't just go and pick the craziest person around like the Republican Party tends to do in Arizona and stuff. So use that to your advantage, right? Like, if you have a high enough profile, if you're like a state senator, if you're a mayor, as a lot of our candidates tend to be, if you have money and you can just air good advertisements so people know who you are, that's how you win these votes. You don't win it by saying, I'm out here because I believe in a 4-day work week. Because that's not something you believe in. You're saying it just because you want to placate the people that are yelling at you. Don't. Just air ads. Get people to get to know you. It's about building trust with voters. Because voters don't like Democrats, but if you can build trust with them, they're open to hearing you. And that's more or less the way that I look at it. Just get your name out there. And then know that if your name is out there, and you have a good profile and experience, people will be inclined to vote for you even if you don't agree with the group.
It's funny, one of the most impactful pieces of public opinion research I think we did was during 2019 on the Democratic primary voters, showing that the Twitter sphere was not at all representative of primary voters.
No,
and
not at all.
while folks were leapfrogging themselves to the left to get to the questionnaire or the Twitter sphere, they were totally losing the plot with Dem primary voters, because unlike Republicans, we actually care about winning as a party. More than we do about purity, and that, I think, could be a superpower for us. So I'm curious to both of you, as we look forward and we try to grow this room, we try to grow the organizations or groups or even just, voices that are willing to be courageous, what do you think we need to do to catalyze a bigger movement that is aligned with this thinking about winning and about speaking up even if it's unpopular? If you had your magic wand, what would you do with it to make this room 7 times bigger?
I would get more candidates. I think what we need is, I think there's a lot of really great infrastructure that's being built. I think that what we're missing, and you're seeing more of it, and I think it's encouraging from elected officials, but if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to give every elected official the freedom and the courage to just say what they think about every issue. And I think Matt was talking about this a little bit before, but it's like, we're not, the irony of this is that in a lot of these cases, it's the groups who are asking elected officials to lie about what they believe. And they're asking them to take positions that they're visibly uncomfortable taking and that don't really fit them and don't fit their backgrounds and where they come from and their images. And so, if I could wave a magic wand, I would have every elected official just speak freely and demonstrate that kind of leadership. I think we're getting closer. I think you're seeing signs of it. I think that members it's a little bit of the dog whistle moderation. People are saying we shouldn't be woke. They're using these sort of code words. And that's where it's sort of like one step forward, then the infrastructure has to take a few steps forward and lead them, and it's sort of this iterative process. But it really, at the end of the day, it's going to take leaders of the party who are willing to stand up and do this to really generate that excitement and remind people how much fun it is to win. Because, you and I have been doing this, not to date ourselves, but winning's pretty fucking cool. And, a lot of the intra-party rifts and the factional rifts get solved by just winning a bunch of seats and winning the White House. Like, it just happens. And so we need to reorient people back to that. And I think having elected leaders who take the initiative and take it upon themselves to demonstrate that pathway with an infrastructure that can support them every step of the way is a really critical step here.
You're saying it's not that fun to be in the House minority?
I'm a Senate guy, but I've heard it's pretty miserable.
Senate minority is not that great,
not
but
that
the House
bad, not that
minority
great either.
really sucks. Yeah. Lasha, what would you do with your magic wand if you could, persuade other people, catalyze other people with your data and analysis? What do you think needs to happen here?
Well, I could, if I could just wave a magic wand and change something about the democratic infrastructure, forget just like, I can say obviously pick candidates who can win elections, but really if you want to build an infrastructure that's supportive of that, I think what you need to do is we need to get people a lot more comfortable speaking up, even if something's unpopular, and recognizing that ceding power to a bunch of, I don't want to use the groups framing as some be-all, catch-all, but like really ceding power to people who are loud is a choice that you chose to make. No one asked you to take these positions other than a few really fringe activists, and you did it because you thought it would help. Why do you think it'll help? Because they're loud, and being loud is effective. It really works. If people also just, said, hey, I agree with this, or like, I agree with you, it may not be popular, or I get why you're doing it. Those messages of support really do a lot for candidates. I've had a lot of people just tell me like, look, yeah, all that's true, but you don't realize how miserable it is to get people just viscerally hating your guts. And I didn't realize that till it like happened to me, and then I was like, okay, I actually get what you're saying now. Even though you may know something is true, you don't want to say it because people are going to yell. I think the biggest thing that we could do in an infrastructure perspective is just build something that gives people the freedom to speak out and know that like heterodoxy is accepted, right? It's okay to disagree on things, and we can embrace conflict rather than just run from it.
Heterodoxy is accepted. It's in fact encouraged. That's great. I used to say a lot that there are 2 different kinds of moderates that run for office. There's the moderates like John Tester, who might take positions that are pretty left on some things like campaign finance, but then, pretty conservative on other things like immigration. But you knew where he stood, and he said it out loud, and he got yelled at by people on all sides. And then there's the kind of moderates that say, I want to be as quiet as possible so no one can disagree with me. And if I stand here very quietly and do everything perfectly and say nothing that matters, maybe I'll get elected again. And I think you can hear which one of those I prefer. I think you prefer the same. You were going to jump in.
Well,
Adam.
yeah, because when you mentioned Tester, it reminded me, I think the other thing that's important is that what voters are looking for is a mix, right? And, we have a relatively limited political vocabulary in how we talk about these things. And when we talk about moderation, it doesn't necessarily mean taking the position that is in the exact middle on a left-right binary spectrum on every single issue. And because in part because that's not how voters experience it themselves. Voters, what they mean is they say, what voters generally mean is a little from column A and a little from column B, because your average voter thinks of themselves, especially swing voters, as being an independent thinker and not being aligned entirely with one party or the other. So someone like Senator Tester, who would take some positions that were further to the left on some economically populist issues and stuff like that, although he also protected community bankers and stuff in his state, and then would go to the right on other issues. And I think what we used to see was candidates who just were more textured and were more identified closely with their states or their districts that they represented. When I got to the Senate, Democrats held both seats in, let me see if I can do this, Arkansas, both Dakotas, Montana, West Virginia. We had one in Indiana. We had one in Louisiana. We had one in Florida. We had one in Nebraska, right? These are all at the same time. These are states Democrats used to be able to win in. And so people like Mary Landrieu, people like Kent Conrad, people like Byron Dorgan, like Max Baucus, they represented their states. And that doesn't mean moving the entire party in that direction. It just means welcoming people who are going to take those positions because that's where they're coming from. And we completely lost track of that. What we do now is we try to chase people like that out of the party. And that's why we don't have seats in those states anymore. And it feels like we're very far behind from ever being able to get them back. So I think, remembering that this is about texture and this is about heterodoxy is really what it comes down to.
Well, I know I personally am very encouraged about our ability to do something about some of these things, because I think there's a lot of efforts that are nascent, ongoing. I know at Third Way we started what we call the Moderate Power Project, and we've been funding some new and upcoming folks that are in this room, like the Next 50, who does leadership development, folks like the Young People's Alliance, who's doing campus organizing from the center, and a lot of other people, and most proudly on this stage, I will say the Welcome folks, who have done so much to really give us this space for community and build power and create a cohort of those of us who are going to figure out how to turn this around and how to win. So thanks for being here today.
Welcoming to the stage, Lauren Harper Pope, Rebecca Cook, and Janelle Stelson.
Hello, ladies.
Hello.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you. Welcome back. Always good to see you guys. We have been so grateful for y'all's candidacy last cycle. As we mentioned at the front, you guys put your lives on hold and served your communities by running for office against people that you thought were not doing the best job. So thank you for running. Just a reminder, guys, I'm here with Rebecca Cook. She ran against Derek Van Orden in Wisconsin's 3rd last cycle.
Thank you.
And Janelle Stelson, who ran against Scott Perry in Pennsylvania's 10th congressional district. So of 40 Democratic challengers in districts that Trump won by less than 10%, the top 4 overperformers were women, and 2 of them are with me right now. And then the 3rd I'll be talking to later today, which is Congresswoman Kristen McDonald-Rivet. So my question for both of y'all today is, people say ticket splitting is dead, but I think that you guys would probably beg to differ, right? So if you can talk to me about who the Trump Cook voter is and who the Trump Stelson voter was in your district.
So a lot of folks, so I'm from western Wisconsin. It's all along the Mississippi border to Minnesota, and people zig and zag on their ballot in my district. And a big part of how we drew people along was showing up. which seems like that should be the bare minimum. But I've always said that there's no community too small or too red that we're not showing up in. And my district is 19 counties, so I could go around and talk to every Democratic Party. But those aren't the people that are going to help me win a purple district like what I have. And we spent a lot of time in third spaces, going to church basement gatherings for lutefisk lunches. Does anybody know what lutefisk is in here? Could you raise your hand? Norwegians? Okay. It's good fish, depending on who you ask. But like those were the spaces in which we were winning people over, right? And showing up in places that you weren't always seeing a Democrat, and you weren't seeing a lot of Democrats in rural Wisconsin. So a big part of it was showing up. A big part of it was my background and my bio. I grew up on a dairy farm in my district. It's a very agricultural district. And I've lived a lot of the failed policies that many of my constituents have. And so being able to relate to that, I think also waitressing while I'm running for Congress 7 days a week. I work at a great little restaurant called The Good Wives. And I'm proud of that. And I think a lot of my background really connected with people. They felt like I was one of them. And I think we need more working class voices representing us in DC. And you know, from showing up to my background, it was also a message. We were really focused on pocketbook issues, things that were really keeping everyday Americans up at night, you know, listening to what the top of the ticket was talking about, joy. I wasn't seeing a lot of joy from people when I was out and about hearing about how folks were struggling to pay their rent and being able to afford their groceries and fill up at the gas tank and at the gas pump. And so I think we were really laser focused on hearing from people and making sure that we were talking about what their top concerns were. And I think that's why we overperformed in a pretty big way, so.
What about the Trump-Stelson voter?
Well, I will say I am up against the former head of the Freedom Caucus, Scott Perry. That's who I took on. He's now started his 7th term, so he's in his 13th year. I was so hyper-focused on taking down this entrenched, I think, bad guy, that I didn't have a lot of time to think about or talk about the top of the ticket. So it helped that I was up against a guy with a record so bad, he was so extreme that he doesn't even really, not only does he not represent his constituents any longer, which he doesn't show up to see what we care about, what we're thinking about, which as a broadcast journalist for more than 30 years, was something I'd been doing for decades anyway. I'd been listening. I'd been shining a bright light on, you know, what I hope will be constituents' thoughts and fears and concerns, which are certainly growing by the day. I'd been doing that for a long time, listening, telling their stories. I actually got into the race, you know, I covered politics before, but it's a first-time political endeavor for me. And realized that I wanted to take the thoughts and concerns that they'd been having for years and actually be able to do something about them. Instead of telling their stories, do something about their stories. And I gotta say, the Future Caucus, which was outside handing out these, I got elected to get SH, done. I got one of these last year when I was here, and it's on my dresser and reminds me every day why I wanna do the hard work again, because it was the hardest, best year of my life. But here's a guy who votes against us. He votes to hurt us, not help us, every day. I mean, he's kind of God's gift to politics, and if I can't get him this time, shame on me. So I just learned we have the highest concentration of federal workers in Pennsylvania 10 than anywhere else in Pennsylvania. So if I can't get those 5,000 votes out of those, disturbed, disenchanted folk, then shame on me, shame on all of us. So. Again, with the Trump, I was, certainly not wishing him well, but hyper-focused on what I was doing because it really takes a lot to take somebody so entrenched down.
Absolutely, and being hyper-focused on your communities and on the voters that you're talking to every day helps you to be depolarizing, right? Which is something we talk about a lot at Welcome, which is how do we become depolarizers for our communities, right? How do we effectively depolarize our politics? Which is kind of hard to do when you're running for Congress sometimes because you're a local leader, but you're running for a national office. So how did you find the balance and thread the needle on not only like place-based politics, the things that matter most to your voters, but also things that are at the national level still a very big concern for you?
So I think all politics are local. I feel like everybody always says that, but I truly believe that, even running for federal office. And it's like figuring out how to weave that thread in a way that like brings those national politics to really feel like, it's happening in your backyard. And I think right now, not necessarily reflecting on last cycle, but reflecting on this cycle and how that looks different. And like moving forward, it's about how I'm not the messenger. I don't want to be the messenger. I want people that are living failed policies by this administration in my district to be the messengers. People that are feeling the impacts to the cuts in Medicaid and SNAP. I was just at West Salem Dairy Days parade this last weekend in my district, and I was talking to a woman who was like, I just sold all my cows last year, and we wanted to do more crop farming, and now I'm going to take a loss. And that I'm not focusing on me telling that story, but letting her tell that story in our social media and our non-legacy media, that we're really meeting people where they're at. I think for a lot of people, some of what's happening doesn't really change their voting behavior until it really impacts them. And when they're seeing, like, for example, I was at a letter carriers rally around post office privatization, and I was filming Mark, who used to be my letter carrier for my small business, and I was filming Brendan, who was a veteran that chose to come home and put on a different uniform to serve in a different way, who were really concerned about it. And it wasn't me saying, look at me, I'm at this union rally. It was like, listen to these stories and why this is important. And I think as a party, we need to be focusing those voices more than anything, instead of candidates and politicians and think tanks and that kind of thing, is like, how is this impacting regular people?
I would say, yeah. We are living in a day and age where, yes, the cliche is all politics are local, but national issues have never been more important. When you are cutting cancer researchers and your neighbor's child has cancer and could have been helped by those researchers, that gets pretty damn local. When you have a guy who you are going up against who voted against giving firefighters protection from some of the toxic chemicals in their gear. Now, Pennsylvania, I don't know how many, anybody here from Pennsylvania? Woo, in the house, all right.
Strong Pennsylvania contingency.
Yeah, love that.
Okay.
Well, we are kind of neighboring, but anyway. When you have a very conservative Republican congressional delegation, and Scott Perry is the only one who votes against them all the time, I tell people, and in my +5 Republican district, we needed Republicans to win. We lost by 1 point, unfortunately. But, to tell them that Scott Perry in no way, shape, or form resembles a Republican anymore, he's so extreme. All the other Republicans are voting to protect firefighters from the toxic chemicals in their gear, to protect children from being sex trafficked, to protect veterans by housing homeless veterans. And Scott Perry's voting no against all of those things. Those national politics are very, very local. And the voters tell me, I've been listening to their stories for more than 30 years, and they are not shy about coming up, even without a camera now, and telling me what they care about. And so I think it's not exactly breaking news to y'all that we've never seen anything like what's going on right now. And a lot of that, coming out of Washington, which is, I think, deeply broken, is very much affecting us at home.
Absolutely. So Rebecca, this past cycle, you ran an awesome ad, and you were like, everybody in Washington is either too far left or too far right, and I'm somewhere in the middle, like most of y'all here in Wisconsin, right? You probably didn't say y'all, because we say y'all in the South. But anyway, we know what I mean. But you were like basically stating, like, I'm in the middle with you guys, right? What was the reception to that ad, and how do you think it helped you earn trust among your voters?
So I'll talk about kind of where that ad came from. So June is Dairy Month in Wisconsin. June is also Pride Month.
Every month is Dairy Month.
Yes, every month is Dairy Month. But June is Dairy Month in Wisconsin, and we have a tradition in our state where we have dairy breakfasts. Every county hosts one. I have 19 counties in my district. And like 300 people or so stand in line at these events. And it's the best place to talk to farmers. Otherwise, it's hard to connect with them because they're busy working on their farms. And I learned pretty fast, like, how to communicate when you're talking to people and you have no idea where on the spectrum that they fall. And when I would introduce myself, I'd reach out my hand and say, "Hi, I'm Rebecca Cook and I'm a Democrat." And by the time I could get those words out of my mouth, somebody would walk by me because they didn't want to talk to me. And I realized pretty quickly, like, if I was going to want to engage with folks, it was talking about my relatability to them. So, I'd introduce myself and say, "I'm Rebecca Cook. I grew up on a dairy farm." And I think folks in DC are either too far left or too far right, and we need more working class voices to actually get things done for regular people. There's too much chaos and division in DC. And almost always people will go, "Yeah." I don't think I've ever talked to anybody that was like, "No, I love that chaos and division," right? And so, like, the text for that ad, I guess, or, the talk for that ad came from, like, it wasn't a pollster or a focus group. It was from what I was learning connected with regular people in my community, and it was over many, many times that I learned, and that opened up a conversation where we'd start talking about values first, and I think that that's something that we have to do in order to win people back into this big tent. And so I really focused on speaking around values, and by the time that conversation was over, they'd go, "So what party are you from?" And I'd rather that. That's the way that we sell people on the values of our party, is bringing people in that way. And so I think in the reaction to that ad, people were really bought in. People were excited. They were like, "You get me. You get what I don't really feel like a part of the far left or the far right, but I am somewhere in the middle, and I might vote for you now." So, yeah.
And speaking of those values, Janelle, you were a local news reporter for almost 40 years. So you were in everybody's living room.
More than 30, Lauren.
I'm sorry. I was reading from the website, Janelle. Talk to Alma about this. No, I'm messing with you. But, you were a local community leader. You were at people's events. You were breaking their news. You were communicating with them. And then also when you ran your campaign last cycle, you were talking about, like, how do we fix the system that is broken in Washington by, like, banning members from Congress from trading stocks and things like that. So, like, you represent, like, a journalist institution, which Democrats are often, defending, but you're also for changing systems so that people can feel the fairness, right? So how do you talk to voters and earn their trust through doing those types of things?
The same way I've been talking to them for more than 30 years, maybe close to 40, which is that you actually really listen. It's such a lost art, and you don't have to come up with a slate of the issues that are important to people. They'll tell you, make no bones about it. They'll tell you what they care about, and they just want to know that you hear them. I mean, the job title is representative. It's not what you think. It's, you're representing, for me, hopefully Pennsylvania 10. And, that's what matters. Being a credible, trusted voice for more than 30 years is not nothing. People trust me to tell them the truth, and I'm honest almost to, a failing point, because that'll probably be what brings me down one day. If you ask me, does this make my butt look big? I'm probably going to say, well, anyway, a little off politics, off subject, but I think being a credible voice where people trust you, that's what we yearn for from Washington. They don't want somebody who's been here forever and voting against them and to hurt them. Medicaid, we have, well over 100,000 recipients in Pennsylvania 10. Many of them are children who struggle mightily, and people will come up and tell me what their struggle is. This one woman who is a former council member in my district, I didn't even realize has an older, severely autistic son who can't communicate, he can't walk. I was at a small dinner party with her recently, and she excused herself around 7:30 and said, "I have to go put my son to bed." I didn't realize at the time, I thought she meant her young child who needed her, and she started telling me a little bit about her story. This is somebody Medicaid cuts are very personal to, as they are with so many people. People talk about being able to keep their loved ones at home longer and give them a really, the best end of life that you could possibly have. Those cuts are deeply personal. Again, back to the everything national being local. I think you listen, you show up for people. We've had town halls. We call them not Scott town halls because he's invited, but he doesn't come. And, we've had terrific panels, a bunch of union people. One of them focused on Medicaid cuts, and we had the national head of Planned Parenthood come in, terrific speaker, terrific woman, and talked about how it would just impact family planning, which I will also say Scott Perry has, had a nationwide abortion ban, supported that for many, many years now. Doesn't matter, rape, incest, life of the mother. He's for a ban on abortion. And for me, that is such a fundamental thing, and I love that the Welcome folks welcome this, but for you to be in charge of your own body, what a novel concept. To decide when you want to start a family, not when Scott Perry thinks you should start a family, or if you should start a family, kind of a big deal.
Absolutely. So I think our final question here is kind of going off of what Laksha was talking about earlier about, how we shouldn't be afraid to run women candidates, people of color candidates, et cetera, because they're great overperformers, right? And we're sitting here with two of the biggest overperformers from this past election cycle. Women are proven to be able to win in competitive districts like the ones that you guys ran in. And we're going to root for you guys in 2026, of course.
Thank you.
So what would you say, why do you think women are so good at overperforming? Why do you think that women are so great at meeting voters where they are? And what advice would you give to our 2026 candidates who are in the audience today, since we have so many of them?
Well, that's exciting. Raise your hand if you're a candidate in the audience. That's awesome. Well, thank you for being willing to step up, and I would say, the biggest thing, and one of my biggest takeaways is that you can't manufacture authenticity. It sounds very cliche, but be yourself. I think that's what voters are looking for. They are tired of the tired talking points out of DC. I really focus in my communications, making sure things authentically sound like who I am, from writing my own issues page, that my consultants aren't doing that, right? I think it's so important. We're losing our voices, especially working class voices, in our communications, whether that's paid communications or earned. And I think it's just so important to hold on to that and hold on to who you are, and finding those ways in which you can come back to yourself. For me, that's a waitressing shift is one of the most humbling things, where I'm just man, I just feel like me, and I'm connected to my community in a really deep way. Or when I go to a county fair and watch a 4-H dairy show, I used to show cattle myself. It reminds me of why I stepped up to do this work in the first place. And finding those things that you can come back to that keep you motivated and that keep your why so crystal clear in your mind, I think is the best advice that I could give, and just to not get lost in what everybody wants you to do or everybody wants you to say, but to just really be yourself, because that's what voters are really looking for.
Very good. I will just briefly say, again, I think you have to listen. I think you have to show up, whether it's dairy days or whatever it is in your district.
A lot of dairy in this conversation.
You have to be everywhere, and then you have to be accountable. And I, again, think this mantra of getting elected to get things done, I am so disappointed. Not only are a lot of things that are going on right now with this administration really dangerous for a lot of people, but for instance, Mother Earth. If we don't mitigate the damage that we have done, we're not going to have a place to live, and none of the rest of this is going to matter. Do you hear anybody? I know, and you young'uns, you should be pretty angry at us right about now. I would like to see us make a better future for you, and it's not the kind of things we're talking about now. There is so much noise coming out of Washington that doesn't have anything to do with our lives for the most part. And it's really, it's disappointing and dangerous. And I would just like to see us concentrate on the things that are germane. I would like to get elected to get stuff done. I think it's really, really important. And I think you got to hold your leaders accountable. While everybody's trying to figure out the path forward, and Welcome Pack has been doing this so well, really taking stock of where we were, where we are, where we want to be. And finding the voices and the candidates that can help that happen for us and actually make a difference in the world, instead of trying to make political points on the backs of some of the most vulnerable among us. This is a really big damn deal. And you candidates out there, and Rebecca, you are so great at embodying this. This is important stuff, and this is the way we move forward. And if you're not ready to really, really listen and work and not think that you're a big deal, but that you want to represent the folks around you, then don't run. Because I got to say, last year was the hardest year of my life, and I already had a really demanding job before that, but it was also the best year of my life. If you do this right, we all are better moving forward.
Well, if you guys see Rebecca Cook or Janelle Selson ad on your timelines, please slide them a little money so they can do some good work. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Welcoming to the stage, Liam Kerr and Congressman Tom Suozzi.
I feel like I overdressed.
So we are thrilled to have Congressman Tom Suozzi from the Empire State
My cousin.
here with us today. Laksha, did a lot of math, as he said earlier, and we've thrown around charts and numbers and equations. So forgive me for going back to the simple version for a minute. Congressman Suozzi's district voted for Donald Trump by 5 points. He won by 4 points. And in absolute numbers, out of all 435 members of Congress of either party, that puts him fourth in running ahead of their presidential nominee. And we've been talking today about this industry, $15 billion a cycle in elections, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars in spending. So are people beating down your door to learn how we do it?
There's some people that are soliciting my opinion as to what to do, and I feel like more people listen to what I have to say than when I was in office before George Santos. But I'm beating down their doors. I'm trying to spread the word as to what I think we need to be doing in order to win elections. Because when everything's said and done, we can be anxious and nervous about what's going on, but the main thing we have to do is win. If we don't win, we can't get things done. So we have to win. And so anybody who has anxiety or nervousness, do something to go win.
And the proof is in the pudding in your wins. But I think one thing that in following you and learning more about your style of leadership is you're very focused. And voters can tell. One slide David Shore will walk through later today that many of you have likely seen shows that on issues that voters prioritized most, they trusted Democrats least. Border, inflation, the top issues for voters, they ranked Democrats far behind Republicans in which party they trust. And it was very clear, both in your special election victory and again in November, that voters knew you knew their priorities, and they trusted you, clearly. What can the broader party learn about that as we may face new challenges, new issues on which trust and priorities are paramount?
So the most important thing that I'll say, and I think one of the simplest things to understand today, is something I keep on saying over and over again. If you ask the American voters what are the issues they're most concerned about, the top 5 issues, they say the economy, immigration, taxes, crime, and health care. That's what the American people say are their top 5 issues. If you ask the same people, what do you think the Democrats are focused on? They say choice, LGBT protections, health care, so there's a little bit of crossover there, saving democracy, and climate change. So those are all 5 very important issues, but they are not the issues we're going to win a national campaign on. So I've got a 100% rating from Planned Parenthood. I have a 100% rating from the Human Rights Campaign. I'm good on all the issues. But that's not what I campaign on. I campaign on the economy, immigration, taxes, crime. That's what the people are talking about. When I ran my special election, I made a big focus, actually in my district back then, it wouldn't be the same right now, I don't think, but the number one issue was immigration. And I started talking about immigration. And I was one of the first people to start talking about the bipartisan Senate deal that had been negotiated. It was during a special election in February of 2024 that I won. And a lot of consultants and a lot of senior people in the Democratic Party said, why are you talking about immigration? That's a Republican issue. I said, no, it's not. That's what everybody's talking about. That's what they talk about when they go out to a party or a family dinner, or that's what they're talking about all the time. So you have to talk about what the people are talking about, and you have to address their concerns with potential solutions. If you try to just take the what is perceived as being the orthodoxy of the party, especially when you're losing, you're not gonna persuade people that you're the right person for the job. One of the most impactful things that ever happened to me, as far as advice on this topic, was after Donald Trump won in 2016. In early 2017, there was a meeting at the DCCC, and there was about 50 people at a big round table, and everybody's like, how could this happen? What happened? How did this happen? And it was a union guy, building trade union, who said something like, the Democrats used to show up at the church picnics and the bars and would talk to us. Nobody does that anymore. So a key to success in politics is actually to talk to people and to find out what they're saying. You can be informed by polls, but it has to be informed by real life experiences, talking to people. Remember the movie about Bill Clinton, the old, I don't know if this is maybe too old, Primary Colors? One of the greatest scenes in that movie was Bill Clinton late at night talking to the guy in the donut shop, about what was going on in his life and what was happening. If you want to be an effective elected official, if you want to be an effective politician, you have to talk to people and find out how the issues that we're analyzing and discussing and debating affect people in their real lives. Right now, we're spending all this time on the reconciliation bill. First of all, nobody knows what a reconciliation bill is, and we've gotten very little press on it because the newspapers are covered with the things that Trump is distracting us on, including the plane from Qatar. That was in the middle of all the stuff going on in the reconciliation. So that's easy to say, that's terrible, he's so rotten, but while we're talking about that, we're not talking about the fact that we're cutting taxes for the wealthiest Americans that don't need it, and we're cutting health insurance for the people that need it more than anybody else. So he's distracting us. It's exactly the same, and am I talking too much? So it's exactly the same as during the debate, the presidential debate, when they said, Mr. President, you want to do something about the border, why won't you support the bipartisan immigration border bill from the Senate? And his answer was, if you remember, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the pets. So he distracted everybody to talk about this crazy thing, and everybody talked about it literally for 6 weeks. We was all so fun, we saw the memes, with the dogs talking to the cats and all that's funny, and we were laughing, but we weren't talking about the fact that immigration, which is supposed to be one of the most important issues in the country, there's a bill to solve that, and he won't support that. So we have got to not be distracted by the popular thing or the orthodoxy. We have to look at the polls, we have to look at the issues, but we have to talk to the people and find out how that's affecting them in their lives and how they perceive it.
Absolutely. The focus, also has a patience component to it, it seems. You're letting pitches go by. You're focusing on the parts of the strike zone where you can crush it. And a lot of the very successful candidates that we've had up here so far today came from non-candidate roles. Becca in a restaurant, Janelle in a TV studio, Adam in business. But public service is very clearly in your bones. It's a archetype that I think we could learn a lot from. And a lot of centrists from both parties point to the same kind of sampling of people including, Joe Manchin. His uncle was first elected statewide in West Virginia in the 1960s. Lisa Murkowski also dates back, her family holding statewide office, multiple generations. Larry Hogan in Maryland, his father was a big Nixon impeachment voter. Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, his father also in the Nixon administration. And so you have a lot of people that many centrists in both parties have, in a way, been clinging to, who have this service in their bones going back quite a ways. And your father was mayor of Glen Cove, your city, and then you were mayor subsequently, and have lived out a life of service.
My uncle was the mayor, and my cousin was the mayor. So I just want to take quickly about my father, if I can. My father was born in Italy, came to the United States as a young boy, first kid in the neighborhood to go to college, went to Fordham to study education, fought in World War II as a navigator on a B-24, got the Distinguished Flying Cross, came back and went to Harvard Law School on the GI Bill, unheard of for an Italian immigrant in the 1940s. Everybody hated the Italians because the Italians, Mussolini teamed up with Hitler during World War II. Between that and the mafia, you couldn't get to first base. He graduated from Harvard. He couldn't get a job at a big law firm. He went back to our hometown in Glen Cove. He teamed up with another Italian guy, started a law firm. He ran for city court judge and became the youngest judge in the history of New York State at 28 years old. What a country. So I tell that story because on immigration, for example, it kills me that immigration has become such a negative issue. When I look at America, I think of America through the lens of the American dream and immigration, and now immigration has become this toxic, negative connotation, and it's really a big part of what America's built on. So yes, it's in my family history. I think with that comes sort of first of all, you meet a lot of people, which helps a lot. You're used to talking to people about the issues I was talking. I'm used to talking to people in all different types of environments. I have a confidence based upon that experience of talking to people that I know this is what the people care. They say, well, the polling shows. I said, yeah, but I talked to this guy the other day, and I talked to this one. And you have to be able to marry what the polling is showing you with real life experience of what people are saying. And I think that I have and plus, I've been beaten very badly in a lot of races. I ran for governor of New York twice. I got killed both times, less than 20% of the vote in Democratic primaries. Once against Eliot Spitzer, didn't turn out very well for him either, but once against Governor Hochul, who we get along very well now. But I know I'm in politics. I want to make the world a better place to live in. So I'm going to try and do what I think is right. I think most people in politics are going to do what's right. And if you're a person who wants to be in politics because you want to do what's right, you can't let yourself be pushed around by well-meaning advisors and consultants. You have to talk to people. You have to inform yourself as to what the people you want to represent are actually thinking and feeling. And that just takes time and effort and a desire to actually solve problems.
And the confidence is clear, confidence, patience, focus. We're trying to give people more confidence. These candidates who we're so grateful to be here today, we know there's more people out there that can come and hopefully gain more confidence from learning from people who have overperformed and have focused on it, and not have to wait 60 years for their grandkids or kids to figure it out. Kind of pivoting from looking back to past generations, you've adapted, it seems like, incredibly well to the new media environment, this fractured media ecosystem where some of the pressure comes from. And just last question, we'd love for you to touch on your ability to make that change and communicate in a way that, as was noted earlier, is much discussed in the postmortems.
This is really important to understand because Trump figured this out before we did. And the media environment is no longer, you know this, television and newspapers and weekly newspapers, and that's still a very important thing. You can't ignore it. It's really important. But traditional media is just one bucket. Then there's social media. Now, I used to think that social media, the only way you could get people to follow you or like your stuff or give you small dollar donations was to say extreme, crazy things. Hence, Trump says things on the right, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says things on the left. The more extreme things you say, the more follows, the more likes you'll get. It doesn't have to be that way. Ethan on my team has done a great job in helping me in understanding at how you have to treat it like you're building a field organization. You have to find other people that are in your same milieu, that feel the same way that you do, and get them to post and repost your stuff. So whereas when I just post something, historically, I'd get 1,000 views, 2,000 views, 4,000 views, maybe sometimes I'd get something would go for 20,000 views. Now I can get 1 million views or 2 million views, but because I'm working with other people that are in the same, have the same agenda, so to speak. So there's traditional media, social media. Then there's podcasts. Of the top 500 podcasts in America, 400 are right-leaning, 100 are left-leaning, and 50 of those 100 beat the you-know-what out of the Democrats on a regular basis. Then you have national media, and then you have the sub-rosa stuff that's happening on WeChat and WhatsApp and other places where, and often a lot of ethnic media, where you have to be there to have somebody to try and respond to what's going on in these environments. And again, that's a matter of talking to people who are playing in those ways. And you have to decide you're going to put the time and attention into it. You know, we saw with the presidential race, we spent all this money on traditional broadcast and on television, which historically was the right thing to do, and you can't ignore it, but you have to spend money in figuring out your social media team and building this field organization, spending the time to go on podcasts and which podcasts are the right ones, national media, of course, and then figuring out people that will be your emissaries in these other environments, ethnic media and sub-rosa type of WeChat and things like that.
Beautiful. That's a great place to end. Congressman Tom Suozzi, thank you.
Thank you,
so much.
everybody. Thank you, Liam.
Was I supposed to take this?
Welcoming to the stage, Josh Barrow and Congressman Richie Torres.
Good afternoon, everyone. Congressman, thank you for joining us all here.
Of course. George Santos couldn't make it, so I'm the other gay Latino congressman from New York. So,
Yeah, you're holding down that fort all by yourself now. It's, yeah. So for those who don't know, you represent a district in the Bronx that Kamala Harris won by 48 points last year, which is a lot, but it's not a lot compared to the 71 points that Joe Biden won it by 4 years earlier. When you talk to voters in your district, what do you hear from voters who normally are with us, but who last time chose to vote for Trump or chose not to vote?
yeah, to underscore that point, I represent what historically has been the most Democratic district in America. In 2012, Barack Obama won 96% of the vote.
Wow.
In New York 15 in the Bronx, like Republicans were as common as unicorns. And flash forward to 2024, there's a 22-point swing toward Donald Trump, not only in my district, but also in AOC's district, in Grace Meng's district, which has a significant Asian population. And I do think it's the Ronald Reagan question. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And if you were to ask working class voters in districts like mine, they would tell you I'm paying double or triple the cost for groceries and gasoline. I see a catastrophic mismanagement of the migrant crisis whose impact was felt not only at the border, but in cities like New York, whose shelter system and finances were completely overwhelmed. And so I thought the two main issues in the 2024 election were inflation and the migrant crisis, and the voters punished us for what they took to be as failed governance. I mean, that's the reality.
To talk specifically about the migrant crisis, there's sort of two failures that I think ultimately are Democrats' fault in different places. First, you had the failure of the Biden administration to control migration. You had all these people showed up in the United States. And then in New York, you have a long-standing set of policies and norms, a court decision that requires a right to shelter, so that when the migrants got to New York, the city ended up spending billions of dollars to put them up in tens of thousands of hotel rooms. And I think Simon Van Zylen-Wood actually is here from New York Magazine, had a great piece right after the election, talking to a lot of immigrants in New York saying, well, no one put me up in a hotel when I got here. What are we doing to make sure that doesn't happen again? Is there in New York, what is the sense of policy changes so that people don't feel that the city and the state's spending priorities are people who are kind of not even supposed to be here?
Yeah, so New York has a right to shelter policy, which I feel has been taken to an extreme. I do fundamentally support a right to shelter for long-term residents of New York, because I do feel it has prevented the kind of catastrophic levels of street homelessness that's quite common in the West Coast. So I would not recommend repealing the policy altogether. But if you treat it as every person from every corner of the earth has a right to housing immediately upon arrival in New York State, well, then that's going to be a subsidy for a massive wave of migration. So I would support a reformed version of the policy.
And do you see, is that something that's acceptable within the Democratic Party in New York? I mean, we talk a lot here about the groups.
No.
And so how can you change that?
Politics in New York City is dominated by the groups. I mean, can I take the example of public safety?
Yeah, please.
Right, so I feel New York has the most dysfunctional criminal justice system in the country. Mm-hmm. In the past 6 years, we've seen a 150% rise in the number of repeat offenders for felony assaults, more than 80% for robberies, more than 60% for burglaries and shoplifting. It's the lowest income communities of color, like the ones that I represent, that are the hardest hit. And it's because we have a policy of releasing repeat violent offenders. A small subset of the population is a disproportionate driver of violent crime. And New York is the only state in the country where judges are prohibited from considering the public safety risk of repeat violent offenders. And if you were to present that question to the people of New York in the form of a referendum, it would be an 80-20 issue. Like 80% of New Yorkers, blacks and whites, Latinos and Asians, would vote to empower judges to consider public safety risk because it's a matter of common sense. But the trouble with our politics is that common sense has become dangerously uncommon. And places like City Hall and Albany and even Washington, D.C. are more responsive to the groups than to the people on the ground, and therein lies our crisis.
In other parts of the country, one of the factors that pressures Democrats to take these sorts of concerns seriously is that they'll lose elections to Republicans if they don't. In New York, that's less of an issue. It's, we're seeing massive underperformance by Democrats, but they still win. They still have a large majority in the state legislature. Kathy Hochul still won by 6 points.
I think we have protesters. Welcome.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Wait.
Hundreds of thousands of people dead, innocent women, pregnant children.
Oh, enough already.
Freedom is a beautiful thing. Thank God for freedom. Thank God. We live in a country where you can protest your member of Congress. Thank God. It's a beautiful thing. It is a beautiful thing.
You represent your constituents. You represent a pro-Israel lobby that has given you millions. Do you feel no shame? $500,000 in the last election cycle. You are not a trailblazer. You will be remembered for your support of a genocide. You should not be honored on this stage. You should be tried brought up Israel twice as much as you have brought up Robert.
So, it's funny.
Speaking of the groups.
Yes.
Yeah. Their timing was perfect, I would say.
So, I mean, some of the panelists earlier were talking about how you have sort of secret moderates and Democrats who, they'll whisper views to you, but they don't say them, they don't like to get yelled at. You seem like, I don't know if you like to get yelled at, but you seem at least fairly comfortable with it.
I'm from the Bronx.
Right, so...
when you grow up in the hood, your astroturf agitation has no effect on you. But I feel like what makes me unusual is not that I'm expressing views that are far removed from the mainstream, but I'm often saying what many people are thinking, but are often too afraid to say. And I feel like the greatest threat to our democracy does not come from the far left or from the far right, but it comes from the cowardice and complacency of a center that lives in fear of the extreme. So I felt like FDR was exactly right when he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And I feel like my greatest superpower is that I'm so socially ill-adjusted, I have no need to be loved by anyone. So, because I feel like the Achilles heel of most elected officials is a pathological need to be loved by everyone. And I feel like once you give up that need for approval, you're a free man.
It's funny, the first two Democratic governors to really start leaning on Joe Biden to get out of the race in 2024 were Maura Healey and Jared Polis. And I sort of have a theory here that I think gay people learn early about how to deliver delicate and uncomfortable news to people. I don't know if you feel that, but I think that's... I do want to turn back to New York a little bit because I want to talk about, in addition to Democrats underperforming in elections in New York in the wake of the various difficulties you described there, people are also just leaving the state altogether. And we're likely to lose something like 3 congressional districts in the next reapportionment, in large part because it is just so expensive to live in New York and we're not delivering the new housing and the new infrastructure that we would need to keep up with population growth. And as a resident of New York, I feel a little despondent about this because, we have lots of factionalism and lots of arguing and protesting like we saw here. I don't see any part of the political apparatus in New York that is seriously committed to the idea of a more abundant New York, of much more housing, of much cheaper new infrastructure. Am I wrong about that? Where is that? Where are the politicians who are focused on that?
Look, no state saw a greater swing toward Donald Trump than New York, and that to me was not a coincidence. That was a consequence of popular discontent with a failing status quo. Like, people feel like New York is heading in the wrong direction. We're paying more and more for less and less. We feel like our public safety and our quality of life and our affordability are declining, and our costs are rising, the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, the cost of utilities. And we've seen a mass displacement of the lowest income people. I saw a shocking statistic. 1/5 of the young black population has disappeared in the last 10 years.
Wow.
So in the early 20th century, African Americans fled the South for the North in order to escape Jim Crow. Now, increasingly, the African American community is escaping the North for the South in order to escape the affordability crisis. Like, that to me is a profound moral failure that we have to take to heart as a party that claims to be the party of governing. And, or the New York State budget in 2015 was $142 billion. Today it's $254 billion. Mm-hmm. And I'm not aware of a single New Yorker who has seen a $112 billion improvement in the delivery of government services. The Second Avenue subway has been described as the most expensive mile of subway track in the world. I think the first mile was, I think the first phase was $2 billion per mile. Mm-hmm. The second phase is projected to be more than $4 billion per mile. Right? East Side Access had a delay of 14 years and $7 billion.
It was an Aldamato pet project. That's how long it took to get East Side Access done.
And so just a wise person once said, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. And I feel like we have a choice. We can either double down on a broken system, or we can usher in a new generation of leadership that is committed to disrupting what is a broken status quo. And I would advocate institutionalizing the abundance agenda as the best framework for reimagining governance in places like New York and in the United States writ large.
The lot of abundance fans here today. When I look at policies in New York that stand in the way of abundance, very often if you look under the hood, you eventually find a labor union at the end that is the driver of that. I mean, to take some examples, it is illegal to build a new hotel in New York anywhere in the city without special permission from the City Planning Commission. This is a law that was lobbied for by the Hotel Workers Union and has had the intended effect of shielding existing hotels from competition, driving up hotel rates. Cities also basically banned Airbnb. You talk about the expensive subways. On the operating side, you have a transit workers union that lobbies for things like using two-person crews to drive subway trains, which is done almost nowhere else in the world. On the capital side, it's the construction trade unions that have imposed a lot of practices that drive up cost. We have a law that is supposed to drive the production of new housing, privately built housing in New York City, that was amended at the behest of those construction trades to create union set-asides that have greatly increased the cost to deliver housing under that program and reduce the production. Is there a way to have a pro-abundance Democratic Party agenda in New York without breaking the strong link that exists between the New York Democratic Party and the labor movement?
Although I want to be clear, I do not blame the groups. I blame the elected officials. I think we, the elected officials, should tell the groups, everyone should have a seat at the table, everyone's voice should be heard, but no one's going to have veto power. And we're no longer going to pursue policies that manufacture scarcities. I think that's the burden of elected officials. But I don't begrudge any group for lobbying for its own interests, but I think elected officials need to learn how to say no to the groups.
How do you win an election in New York doing that? I mean, we're having a mayoral election right now, and you have candidates of the left that are, backed by the, traditional organizing constituencies there, and then you have Andrew Cuomo, who you've endorsed, standing as the candidate of the center, but the way you build that coalition in New York City is with the backing of a lot of these groups, including the labor unions, which have largely. How do you build the winning coalition if you're going to be the candidate?
I just want to be. Yeah. I think we have to be careful not to mistake a visible, vocal minority amplified on Twitter for a majority of New Yorkers or a majority of Americans. I feel like most Americans are considerably to the center of the groups of the far right and the far left. So. You can certainly win an election on the strength of your own operation. I feel like we've given far more power to the groups than they should actually have. I think many of these groups are fundamentally unrepresentative of where most Americans stand on the issues. I mean, most Americans want a government that works, a government that can build. Most Americans want public safety, want quality education.
Then why aren't those people in the state legislature in New York? I mean, it seems like we have a system where you have these low turnout primaries.
Because we have no infrastructure. So if you're running on a platform of defund the police, and there's a whole industrial complex, a whole network of institutions that will fundraise for you and provide you with technical assistance and amplify you on social media. And so there's a strong incentive to run on the far left or the far right because that's where the infrastructure lies. But if you're running from the center left, then the burden often falls on you to win on the strength of your own operation. And I feel like if those of us in the center have no infrastructure, the radicalization of our politics will only deepen over time. So I interpret the point of WelcomeFest as an attempt to build infrastructure where none exists.
And so what does it look like in practice? What should people here go home and do if they want to create that sort of infrastructure? I mean, is that something that you see where you are in the Bronx?
You have to be politically and civically engaged because in politics, intensity is destiny. And an intensely visible and vocal minority will often have more power than a silent majority. I mean, that's just the fact. And so we have to match the intensity of the extremes in American politics.
Is abundance actually popular in the middle in a place like New York? I wonder about that. I certainly, when you
I'm not aware of anyone who's against more housing or.
Well, in their own neighborhoods, very often they are.
Fair enough.
I think on crime and immigration, I think there's a very clear story about there's a centrist positioning that is popular, that is excluded for certain institutional reasons, and you can do that and win. If you're talking about coming in and building hundreds of thousands of more homes in New York, I think there's a lot of people who are not politically extreme, but who have a strong view like, well, it's hard to park. I don't like the shadow that building is going to cast. I think it's a real public opinion challenge. Do you have a sense of how to overcome that?
I feel like we need strong leadership. And look, we've seen the YIMBY movement gain momentum even in California, in New York. I mean, to the credit of the mayor and the city council, they just passed a land use reform that will allow for the creation of more housing. So I do feel like, YIMBY politics actually represents the future of cities like New York. I think there's a recognition that we have no hope for addressing the affordability crisis without closing the gap between supply and demand. And we have to build more housing in order to address the root causes of the affordability crisis.
And then, is that something, there have been some efforts around that in Albany too, and that's been key in California, has been statewide reforms. We've seen very little motion on that in New York. Is that something that there's hope and opportunity for?
I mean, we had land use reform in New York City.
In the city, yes.
Yeah, in the city, with the support of the governor. I want to give the governor credit where credit's due. She did support the liberalization of the zoning code in New York City, because under the previous zoning code, 40% of New York's existing housing stock would be illegal.
Right.
Like, that's how draconian the zoning code was.
Congressman, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Welcoming to the stage, Lauren Harper Pope and Congresswoman Kristen McDonald Rivet.
Hello, Congresswoman. Hello. It's so fun to call you that. Welcome to Congress. Oh, that one might not be.
Turn the mic is hot.
Hello. Is this one better? Switch it.
Hello.
There we go. There we go.
Yep.
So we actually recently spoke on the Depolarizers podcast.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us for that. And we talked about how you had the highest war score of the cycle. Like, can we just clap it up for the war score here?
Yeah.
Congresswoman Kristen McDonald Rivet here, she overperformed Harris by 8 points, and her
9,
war score,
sorry.
oh, I'm sorry,
9.
9, my bad, fact check, 9 points, and war score was 8.6, I think. So, like, just an actually incredible overperformance in Michigan. So we talked a little bit with Rebecca and Janelle about this, but you obviously had some voters who voted for both Trump and you, right? Do you want to tell us more about who the Trump-McDonald Rivet voter is, and why do you think you were able to earn their trust?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that. We didn't spend a whole lot of time during the campaign thinking, how do we create McDonald Rivet Trump voters, although we did know that he was going to win the district. The president actually campaigned and did rallies 2 separate times throughout. And just to give you an idea, in my race between the Republicans and the Democrats, there were 86,000 points of TV. It was unbelievable. But what we work to do is just establish who we were as a coalition, who I was as a candidate, which is somebody who's, my husband and I have raised all 6 of our kids in the district. We are involved in our church. We've been involved in the community. They know us. They trust us. So what we do have are a ton of folks that used to and still do believe in this notion that really hard work equals middle class, which is not true. 80% of the jobs in my district pay less than $50,000 a year. And there was this promise growing up that, look, you go out and you do this. Most people were UAW members working for GM, and they watched their parents work really hard and own a home, and this is my story too. My dad actually built the house I grew up in. But now we're talking to people who have 2 and 3 jobs. They're working 60, 70 hours, and they're making $50,000 a year, and they're frustrated and they're angry, and we went directly at that pain point. And I talked about how, I got a 15-year-old boy who I cannot make full. He eats everything in the house. So I worry about the price of a gallon of milk, right? We just simply focused on quality of life, cost of living, and acknowledged and made real the anger they feel about the fact that, to be frank, they're kind of being screwed by the system. And that's what we talked about.
Which sounds so simple. It's like, well, how do we talk to voters? It's like you literally just talk to them and repeat back to them what they're saying to you. It's pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's not unusual in my district to see a McDonald Rivet and a Trump sign next to each other. But I also think, by and large, within the Democratic Party, we have a cultural problem. And this is what I mean by that. We spend a lot of time in rooms with super smart people creating policy agendas and thinking, what words do we have to use? We've got a bunch of Democrats who've just started to curse, right? Like that's the problem is you didn't say fuck enough, so no. Am I allowed to curse? Sorry. You're good. Okay. The real problem is that we have created too many rooms where somebody with mud on their boots doesn't feel like they're welcome. And Donald Trump took advantage of that. And the MAGA movement has taken advantage of that. So on one hand, you think about being angry that you can't afford your medicine, you can't afford your food, and you can't afford housing, and it makes you feel like a failure, working really hard, and it feels like you're failing. And then the party that you grew up in, they're all UAW members, right? This is was default D, but is not talking about any of those things, and in fact spent a good deal of time trying to convince you that the economy was great, and all these good things were happening, and the reality from my district is that's not real for them.
Right. One of our speakers this morning, Jason Mangone at More in Common, they put out a report last cycle about how there is a discrepancy between what voters thought that Democrats prioritized and what they actually prioritized, right? Yeah. To your point. And I think you even said this on the podcast, is let's talk about those things first.
Exactly.
Right? Let's prioritize the things that people are talking about.
So, I think that is really interesting, because if you look at what Democrats have been able to accomplish, and, I was a state senator before I ran for Congress, only for 2 years, but was able to author the largest tax cut for working families in Michigan's history. We were very focused on bringing down the cost of childcare and being able to put more money in people's pockets. We made community college free. These things that are very core to raising a family and existing is the agenda. We don't need a new agenda. There are things we need to do differently, and I'm part of the Abundance Caucus, and I think all of that is exactly right. But when it comes to campaigning and it comes to connecting people, you don't do that by making them feel like you're smarter than they are, or diminish their pain points. So again, it's a cultural issue in the way we talk, not the things that we really advocate for.
Absolutely, and even in the way that we communicate, you guys ran some fun ads this past cycle.
Yeah, we did.
That were very lighthearted. They brought humor into campaigns and humor into politics, and like you said, were more values-based. You had one where your husband was like, "I'm tired of listening to you talk about cutting taxes," and then he rolls out of the car, and then you have another one where
he dies out of a moving car.
Oh, yeah, out of a moving car.
The lawn.
And then another one where you're in a bar and you're talking about, football and family, and you hate Ohio and all the good stuff.
The closing ad of the campaign, I'm in a bar and so this is who I am. And at the very end, I say, look, I root for the Lions. I hate Ohio. And I think most politicians are full of shit. And they slide a beer to me and I raised it up and said, cheers. Right? Because they really people need to feel a sense of connection. They need to feel that you could be their neighbor, and that's not a political ad. That's actually who you have to be to do this job well.
No, that's absolutely right. So we've talked about how you win over voters, particularly in swing states like Michigan, which will remain probably a swing state for the next cycle. When we talked about on the podcast too, what is someone who wants to win in Michigan? What do they need to bring to the table, right? Because you are winning over these working class, middle class, regular American voters, and there are a lot of people who have aspirations for higher office, and they simply just don't know how to communicate with people who live in your state. So what would you say to 2028 or even 2026 candidates?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just basic common sense. It's a very, I believe in a lot of things that are on the progressive agenda. I'm just pragmatic and practical about how to get there. And common sense is the thing I think that people are looking for and finding very little of. But it's also, you really, you have to be authentic, And you have to be willing to sit in uncomfortable rooms and listen to how hard it is for people. And that matters whether we're talking about Israel, Gaza, or whether we're talking about labor or merit-based shops. These are things that we try to get in and out with political platitudes into rooms, and people aren't buying it anymore.
No, absolutely. So even to your point about talking about like the relatability, the humor, the values-based, what are some ways that the party can reframe some of the conversations that are harder to find voters where they are?
I hesitate to actually answer that question, and the reason is that we are so obsessed with the issues that people are still trying to figure out, and obsessed with trying to figure out how to talk about it, that we have stopped talking about strengthening like our strong community schools, and we stopped talking about more good union jobs, and we stopped talking about making sure that everyone has health care and that medicine is affordable. And those are the things we need to talk about. Now, from a policy perspective, we have to do everyone has a voice and meet people where they are and actually do that really tough work, which is about listening and being willing to move forward in the long haul. But if we don't get back to the basics about what's really important to people, because in my district, mostly the people want those things to work, and then they want the government to leave them alone and not make them have to think about the government ever, right? That is the agenda. And to the extent that we can do that, and the extent that people think you're serious about that, I think that is how you win campaigns in tough areas.
Well, you heard it first at WelcomeFest. Congresswoman Krista Pinano-Rivera, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcoming to the stage, Marshall Kozloff, Derek Thompson, and Congressman Jake Auchincloss.
So Derek and I were chatting right before this started, and you're at like week 12 of the book tour. And given the fact that this crowd is here on a Wednesday, we could safely assume they've probably encountered the abundance idea before. So I'll ask you kind of a two-part question to keep this fresh. So one, just quick, easy definition of abundance. But then two, talk about why the affirmative vision of abundance is key. Because I think the biggest frustration a lot of people had, even on the center coming out of November, was just so defensive. It was, how do we moderate? How do we accommodate? How do we get closer to the voters? It really is that sort of positive, forward-facing oomph. So I'd love for both of you to speak to that need for something affirmative.
Great. Thank you for having me. So abundance. The first sentence of the book is something like, to have the future we want, we need to build and invent more of what we need. And then the next 221 pages are explaining how that's true. And build and invent. That means building what we already know how to build, houses, energy, and inventing things that need to exist but don't yet exist. Cures for cancer, cures for Alzheimer's. And the latter half of the book is about policies for scientific breakthrough and technological development. And so, really it's a book about getting out of our way to make good things possible. It's funny, some people that I've talked to throughout the book tour have said, this was a really optimistic book. Thanks for writing such an optimistic book. And I was like, the process of writing this book was like a process of talking about all the various ways that liberal policymaking or the rules in the books restrain housing development here and restrain energy construction over here, and state capacity is terrible over here, and the NIH has the following problems, and we can't build this kind of technology. It felt like, just relentless diagnosis. It felt like a patient walking into a doctor's office, and the doctor is like, well, your Achilles torn, and also your ACL is broken, and also there's like a machete sticking out of your back. Like, the book was just like a lot of like bad. But I do think that like the beginning, the opening, and the conclusion are a little bit optimistic. I think that's a part of why some people read the book and they said this is optimistic. I think some of them just looked at the cover. I think certainly some of our critics just looked at the cover and then wrote their critiques. But like, I think some people just draw a certain attitudinal vibe from the book, that the cover has, a cut open earth and half of it is blooming with a bunch of flora and fauna. But I also think that like, and this is like the serious point that I want to make, that when people feel a vague sense that shit is broken, there's a kind of optimism that's inherent to specificity. That even without trying to sound optimistic or hopey-changey, just telling people that they're right about their vague spectral feeling that shit is broken, that housing can't be built, that energy can't be built, that government doesn't work, that we can't invent. Being able to be really specific about, I think, why you're upset. It's because this rule is getting in our way. It's because this process is getting in our way. It's because this cultural attitude is getting in our way. When you can be specific for someone who feels this spectral sense of anxiety, that specificity registers as optimism. And I think that's obviously true both for someone writing a book and also probably for a politician crafting a message. It's easy to be vague and hopeful. It's easy to be vague and negative. What's harder is understanding very concretely, what am I angry about? What is the specific, concrete motivation for the thing that makes me passionate? And the book really was written in a flight of passion because we really were upset about the ways that so many different processes, and especially those laws and rules in liberal states and liberal cities, are getting in the way of us building and inventing.
Congressman, what do you think about the idea of needing to have an offensive, forward-facing vision?
I agree. And I mean, Americans know what Democrats are against. They don't know what we're for. And if we are going to earn Americans' trust to govern at the state and the federal level, we have to explain what we are for. And what Derek and Ezra have done is they've written an economics textbook for the Democratic Party. And when you read an economics textbook, what you learn is that, hey, most of the time markets work pretty well. And when markets are not working very well, ask yourself what the bottlenecks are that are impairing the market function. And the criticism that they're getting from the left is, oh, you're insisting that it's only the government that it's impairing the functioning of markets. Well, sometimes it is. You know, zoning laws are impairing the functioning of housing, and energy permitting laws are impairing our ability to build nuclear. But sometimes it's big business that are making markets not work well, right? You look at the pharmacy benefit managers that are the middlemen of drug pricing. They're making our drug pricing supply chain all messed up. And I think good economics tells you you're agnostic as to what is an impairment of a functioning market. You just go unplug that bottleneck.
So, Congressman, you just said bottleneck twice, so I have to move ahead in the script and ask the question you two both knew was coming. Demand Progress, a lefty anti-corporate power group, put out a poll last week, and we could have qualms with the wording and the framing, but like at a key level, it put together two messages. One was a populist message, putting corporations and corporate power at the center of America's problems. The abundance version of the message focused on bottlenecks, housing, manufacturing, energy, et cetera, transportation as being key to the story here. Democrats in their poll found the bottleneck story less compelling than the corporate power story. I would love to hear both of your reaction to the broad takeaway of the result, rather than the qualms we could have with the word.
Yeah, it's what happens when you test an economics textbook against like a romance novel and tell people, what do you like to read better? Like, it's such a bad faith poll. I would never go out there and campaign on like, let's be bottleneck detectives to figure out whether, 4-story modular needs to have a steel chassis under HUD regulations. Like, no, I'm gonna say, housing's too expensive, you're mad at your landlord for keeping on raising the rent. The best thing we can do is to give your landlord more competition by building some housing. Okay, like, of course, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. And I'm pretty unwilling to accept the lecture on corporate power from the left when they are carrying the water for the most pernicious, nefarious corporations in modern history, which are the social media corporations. Every time we try to take on big tech, which are attention fracking our children, which are corroding our civil discourse, which are monetizing our attention spans, it's the left that's carrying the water for their spurious political arguments. They're the ones who are in the pocket of these big tech companies.
I think it's a really compelling answer. I certainly did not think when I started my book leave in 2023 that eventually sentences from chapter 5 would be poll tested against the case against corporate power. But I think it's important to say that, we didn't write the book for it to be a good bumper sticker. We wrote the book for it to be a good book. And good books can inspire good bumper stickers. And good books can maybe inspire good politicians. But
bumper stickers shouldn't be book quotes, and frankly, nobody votes for a book in an election. They vote for people. And people are these really, this is gonna be an obvious one, complex things. Like Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not John Maynard Keynes turned into a person, right? He was this complex thing. He was a patrician who was a rebel against his own class, who was taking some ideas from an economist named John Maynard Keynes and turning that into an entirely new kind of political order that was so popular it redefined American life for 20 years and arguably for the next century. But it wouldn't have made any sense for FDR to like take a page from like a Keynes textbook and say, I should poll test this against my case against Herbert Hoover. No, like it's okay to be inspired by an idea and not want to make that idea the single thing that you talk about in precisely that language to voters. So I'm in a weird way honored, I'm flattered that they chose to make like almost literally a sentence from like page 167, a concept that you would poll test against something that sings beautifully in the poetry of campaign language, which is the biggest problem in American life is corporate power or something like that. But I think fundamentally, elections are hypotheses. I want people who want to run for office to be inspired by these ideas and understand the right or figure out the right language to run inspired by this book without necessarily quoting something that's just ripped from page 168.
And a follow-up to you, Derek. So after this poll came out, the sort of abundance Twitter generic response was basically, this is a governing agenda, it's not a campaign plan. And you put out a really interesting tweet, I think it was yesterday or the day before, where you said, it's actually much more complicated than that. There's a relationship between governing and elections. So please expand on that, and I'd love to hear that from you too, Congressman, how you think about this relationship between the two.
Well, so some people, I think, after this poll came out, and I haven't honestly spent a lot of time thinking about this poll, but we've now doubled the amount of time that I spent thinking about this poll on this stage. The poll came out, and I saw some people defend me and Ezra by saying you have to understand that abundance is about policy, not about politics. And this was a sentence that I sometimes saw being offered as a way of almost apologizing for the fact that the quote from page 168 didn't poll particularly well. And the truth is that while I, of course, respect and am grateful for everybody who comes to our defense, I don't actually agree that abundance is about policy, not politics. I don't like drawing this really sharp line between policy and politics. I think good policy, good ideas, makes good outcomes more likely. And it's easier to practice politics when you have good outcomes. Joe Biden had terrible outcomes in 2023 and 2024 because of inflation. Incumbents all over the world had terrible outcomes because of inflation. That made politics really, really hard. But I think that good ideas make good outcomes more likely, and good outcomes make good politics more possible. So I don't like this idea that abundance is just about policy, not about politics. No, abundance, the ideas in this book, are about fixing the cost of living crisis, about making housing cheaper, about making energy cheaper, about making governance higher quality, about making scientific breakthroughs that save our lives, the lives of our children and our parents and our lovers and our partners more likely. In a world where we get those good outcomes, good political messaging is a cinch. You elected me, I made the world better, elect me again. That's straightforward. You don't need any poll testing in order to get that message across. It's much harder. Where you have to start paying the really brilliant consultants a lot of money is when you were elected and you had bad policies and then everything went to shit, and now what do you do, right? That's the world that Donald Trump is, I think, bringing himself into when he gets elected because of a cost of living election, and the first thing that he does is raise the cost of everything. That makes politics really, really hard on him, and you can see it in the approval rating because it's fallen pretty precipitously in the last few weeks.
And Congressman, something you could very helpfully let Derek and I do is take this conversation away from purely just housing. Speaking of interpreting the book, you'd think from the discourse and the reviews that you and Ezra had written a book that was 98% about housing, and then there's 2% of science and technology and innovation, but there's a broader side here. And Congressman, when you and I have spoken about abundance, I've appreciated your ability to bring abundance beyond just housing in terms of an agenda. So I'd love for you to talk about that, and then Derek, you could come in and talk about the undersold story of the science and tech.
Absolutely. So, for example, I think one of the big ideas Democrats should campaign on is curing Alzheimer's. By the year 2050, we're going to have 15 million Americans with Alzheimer's disease. Each one's going to require 3 caregivers, paid or family. And the emotional, financial burden, both as a country fiscally and on individuals, is going to be just absolutely staggering. And you know what? We actually have basically no idea how to cure Alzheimer's right now. And the scientific moonshot that this president is orienting the country towards is Mars. And if Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, fine, but I think we should be oriented towards curing Alzheimer's disease, which is actually going to help people much more materially in the near term. And we use that as the cornerstone of a scientific agenda that calls for more than doubling our research and development intensity from about 2.5% of GDP, where it's at now, post-war low, to closer to 6%, which is about where it was after World War II, and it's about where innovation powerhouses like Taiwan and South Korea and Israel are at right now. So you give people that goal, and then you say, and let me tell you how we're going to get here, and why it makes sense to invest in the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, et cetera. Similarly, on education, I think this is a massively untapped area for Democrats. Democrats made a catastrophic mistake by closing the schools in 2020, and 25 million American students are behind grade level on reading and writing right now. And you know what, candidly, we don't have a plan, and we owe a plan to the American people, because it was Democrats that did it. And part of that plan needs to be surging one-on-one, high-dosage tutoring to every single student in America. We know how to do it now. I've seen it in my own district. We got to build 1,000 trade schools to get people building again, but we need to have a really ambitious education agenda that taps into the brilliance of the American people. We're so obsessed right now, or not we, the administration is so obsessed about all these Chinese students doing research in America. It's like, yeah, you know what, the Chinese are outscoring us on science and math right now. Stop worrying about the Chinese students, they're scoring well. Worry about American students right now who are entering 9th grade with a 6th grade education.
And Derek, I'd love you to expand on like your sort of interpretation of like the undercovered side of like the science and innovation part of the story.
Well, one of my favorite parts of the book to research was Operation Warp Speed, which I think is probably the strangest public policy in modern American history. It's arguably, I mean, Representative, you're the expert here. Is it the most successful medical innovation policy in American history on a bang for buck basis? Is it that or the sort of acceleration of like penicillin in World War II? It's got to be right up there.
It's right up there for sure.
Right up there with maybe bang for buck, the most life-saving innovation policy in American history. Saved more lives than the Apollo project, for sure. What happened after Operation Warp Speed? Republicans became even more of an anti-vax party. Donald Trump never talks about the law, and Democrats barely talked about the law themselves. And so, I mean, imagine if we landed on the moon like 8 years into the Apollo project and no party talked about it. Like that's the equivalent of what happened after Operation Warp Speed succeeded in bringing down the fastest vaccine development from 10 years to 10 months. I think any rational government should have said, how do we do Operation Warp Speed for anything? How do we take the lessons from this policy and say, okay, we had this idea that said we're going to set this incredibly ambitious goal, we're going to map out the whole life cycle of developing a vaccine, we're going to understand where we need to push money at the front end, we're going to understand where we need to do what's called pull funding, which is to say we're going to promise you a prize if you develop this vaccine, and we'll give you the money at the end of the process, and we're going to go through, there's a fly going around me, we're going to find a way to make sure that every single time a company faces a bottleneck, like for example, the vaccine has to be sent in these very, very cold little glass containers. We're going to contact Corning, a glass manufacturer, to make sure that they make exactly the containers that can bring this vaccine across the country to CVS. I mean, it's unbelievable what we did, and nobody cares. It's unbelievable how few people care, especially in the party responsible for the accomplishment, because they were in power. I think it's crazy, and I do think that any rational, smart government or state would say, what other challenges are amenable to this kind of policy? Is Alzheimer's amenable to an Operation Warp Speed? Maybe not, because we don't even know yet like what the fundamental basic science of or basic reality of Alzheimer's is. So we thought that there was a plaque hypothesis, the amyloid plaque hypothesis, threw a bunch of money into there and it didn't particularly work. But I would love us to take seriously this idea that yes, housing is important, yes, energy is important, but The future is also something that Democrats should be excited to talk about, and the future is made better by precisely these kind of breakthroughs.
Something I'm curious to hear about from the two of you. So I've spent most of my career covering the populist right. And when you do that, what you come to realize is regardless of its merits, like the sort of case for MAGA is pretty straightforward. Elites drove this country into the decade for 4 years. Over 4 decades, elites drove this country into the ditch. And MAGA is going to overturn those elites, they're going to attack their institutions, and that will magically make things better. I really struggle to see center and center-left coded institutions also coming up with their own version of a story that I think will make sense for Americans what's happening in this moment right now. I think the populist left has a story. I don't think the center has a story to the same degree. So I'd love to hear from the two of you, what story would you tell, and this could extend abundance, about America in the year 2025?
I think it's, let me start by saying I don't know the answer to that question. And that's okay, because it's the year 2025, and Democrats, for the first time in 20 years, have a totally open primary ahead of us in 2028, and we should be having a vigorous internal debate about ideas, messages, policies, and as we go out there and talk to voters about them, you'll see it in New Jersey and Virginia with the gubernatorial races, you'll see it in the midterms, you'll see it, of course, in the presidential primary. Voters will tell us what resonates and what doesn't. So we should all be putting ideas out there. I would say one thesis that I would have is it's about taking back control. I think one of the very core themes along all developed economies over the last 10 to 15 years has been a spiraling sense that things are getting out of control. That whether it's migration patterns, whether it's the cost of living, whether it's the competence of governance, that voters feel like I don't have control anymore. And this presidency has felt out of control, even to Trump voters, people who are reluctant Trump voters. And I do think there is a message that can resonate amongst Democrats, amongst never Trump Republicans, amongst unenrolled voters about we are going to help you take back control. Take back control where we can stabilize the politics, take back control where you feel like you can breathe financially in the middle class, where you're not getting squeezed by housing and energy and childcare prices so badly that your prospects are dimming and your kids are even worse. It's this sense of agency in a world that it feels like it's been spiraling.
I love this question. I don't have a perfect answer to it. If you and I, Marshall, if we were having like a debate on this stage, if you and I were like running in a primary, and you said that. You said, the far right has a story, and they've won. The far left has a story. The center doesn't have a story, and that's a problem. What I would say in response to that is, yeah, stories are for children. Americans need a plan. Americans need solutions. So I would prefer to tell the audience, turning to them, gesturing broadly, to say, yeah, the right has a story, it's bullshit. The left has a story, I think it's wrong. You don't need a story, you need a place to live. You need an electricity bill that you can afford. You need childcare that you can afford that won't bankrupt you. I'm not a storyteller. I'm not going to tell you a bunch of just so stories about how to make the future better. Because those stories tend to be bullshit, and you're better than that. You deserve more than that. You have problems, and I recognize them, and I wrote a book about it, and I think I have solutions. That's what I would say. Now, backing out of that, what I just did is also storytelling, right? It is essentially saying, like the story that I would tell is essentially that American politicians, in some categories, have fallen too in love with this idea that you don't have an agenda until you have a story. No, you can have an agenda. You can just have the answers. You can just have a plan to make people's lives better. And you don't necessarily have to wrap it up in a complex story that belittles elites or finds the bad guy or says, if a company gets relatively big, it's always evil. You don't have to lie to people to win elections. And I think it's useful to say, I think it's useful for folks maybe in this room, and maybe people who like the book, to say, maybe one way that we can distinguish ourselves is by not feeling like the only way to win is to tell a story that deep down we recognize as a lie.
So last closing 30-second limit answer for the two of you. One of the things that Ezra said when he was promoting the book was the many ways he wrote his parts of abundance to repair the left's relationship to technology and with the tech industry. And obviously with Elon falling out with Trump, we've seen some sort of, I think, naive, like, let's just get Elon back, like it's easy and there's no cost there. But just sort of close from the two of you, how Democrats should think about the tech center when it comes to these abundance ideas and an agenda in general.
I am very receptive and supportive of tech in the world of atoms. We need to have more technology for factory-built housing, for small modular nuclear reactors, for shipbuilding technologies. I am very hostile to the direction of technology in the world of bits. Because right now you got Mark Zuckerberg talking about AI chatbots replacing friends for kids. And I got 3 little kids, and I don't want them to have AI friends. I want them to have real friends. And these companies are out of control.
Atoms over bits. Amen to that.
Perfect place to end. Thank you for joining us all here.
We got a birthday today, which is very exciting. I think the voice of God is going to call up Matthew Iglesias.
Welcoming to the stage, Matthew Iglesias, Congresswoman Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, Congressman Jared Golden, and Congressman Adam Gray.
So it's Marie's birthday, so we gotta sing happy birthday. But before we do that, we have to figure out what to get her. So I asked Marie what her favorite candy was. And she gave a super normal body parts gummies. Remember the Halloween? So we got these, there's let's see, servings times. There's about 60 in here. But I think there's heads, there's hearts, and I think there's a good analogy there where we've shown some charts, some data, there's vibes, there's stuff. But I think people struggle to visualize just how amazing these candidates are. And then to connect those numbers with the fact that there's a real life human beings with heads and hearts and hopes and dreams and fears that feel cross-pressured, that feel nervous. Marie got 11,800 Trump voters to vote for her. And so while we're all singing happy birthday, we have 11,740 more gummy bears that are going to come up and go in here. And feel free to scoop some for yourself during happy hour. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Okay. Well, hello everybody, at least hello again for me. So I'm up here with 3 of the great members of the Blue Dog Caucus. And something I wanted to say just to kind of frame this conversation. I think there's some really bad stuff is happening in Congress these days. A really terrible bill passed the House of Representatives that is going to have devastating impact on Americans' health care, that is going to raise the budget deficit. This has come up to the Senate again now. And if we had 5 more Blue Dogs winning Trump districts last fall, this would not be happening. And this is, I think, something that, progressive-minded people should really appreciate about our Blue Dogs here. If you saw Lakshya's charts at the beginning, these are all 3 people who way overperformed the fundamentals, who got people to cross over and vote for them, and who do that through pragmatism, through certain moderate stances, but also
uphold a lot of really core, important principles and values of the Democratic Party. Jared and Marie, I think, are legends in the moderate community already. But Congressman Gray, I think you are not as well known to the world. Can you just tell us about yourself? Who are you? Where'd you come from? What's going on here?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. I don't know that there's a more important event we could all be participating in and working together to an end of actually starting to solve problems for this country instead of just talk about it or explaining to people what their problems are. I'm from California, grew up in the Central Valley, so if you're familiar with California, or not familiar with California rather, it's the part that you wouldn't have heard of. It's not Hollywood, it's not Silicon Valley, it's not San Francisco or sunny San Diego or the beaches. It's a big bunch of ag counties, 5 counties running between Stockton and Fresno, the #1 dairy district in the entire country, actually, and I grew up in the dairy industry. And it's people that make things, that produce things, truck drivers, farm workers, farmers, and really important part of the state. And just to give you an idea, because people don't normally think of California as an ag place or where the farms are, but my district in one county of the 5 counties that I represent produces more dairy than the state of Wisconsin, right? So we do ag at a very high. Well, we're just, when they say big ag, I guess that is us. We're pretty big. But there's a lot of us and a lot of small family farmers. It was a great place to grow up and certainly enjoyed it. Got involved in politics at a pretty young age, working for a gentleman who was the state assemblyman for my area in the state legislature, was the chairman of the Ag Committee, which was appropriate, obviously, to what I had grown up around, which was the dairy industry, building dairy barns, installing dairy equipment. And the area I'm from has a long history with the Blue Dog Democrats. In fact, when the Blue Dog Democrats were founded, our member of Congress was one of the co-founders. And since that time, we certainly, as a community, have always been active the formation of the New Dems, the Blue Dogs, trying to chart a path in Washington and in the state capitol of folks that work together, get things done, that collaborate. And I think I've always said that people that have grown up in agriculture do really well in politics. And not just because we're used to shoveling all the shit, but because we actually live in a world where you have to fix problems and you got to fix them now. And particularly in dairy, if you're not familiar with dairies run 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And when something breaks, you don't call and schedule somebody for next Tuesday. You just have to fix it. And I think that's an attitude that we need a lot more of in our politics and in our policy making, which is just solve problems. It's funny to listen to the dialogue, some of which I'm sure we're going to have this afternoon, about how to fix the Democratic Party or how to fix our politics or how to fix our country. And I guess I would just say, well, we should start by just solving some problems. Just do something that actually improves somebody's life, and the rest will follow. So it's wonderful to be here, a little bit about my background, and excited to be with these 2 wonderful people who have been welcoming to me since my arrival in Washington, D.C., and have been great partners in trying to make change here in our nation's capital.
So, Congressman Golden, you wrote recently about hyperlocalism and hyperlocal leadership. Can you try to explain that idea to people? What does that mean to you?
Well, first I would say I can smell the gummy bears or gummy body parts from here. So, smell good. Come on up, grab them. You don't have to wait for happy hour. Just dig in. Hyperlocalism. A lot of people probably don't know this, but if you went and you looked at the kind of original mission statement of the Blue Dogs when they came about in the 90s, it's just like a kind of 1 paragraph type of statement. And one of the things in there, because everyone talks about fiscal stability, national security as 2 of the pillars of what it means to be a Blue Dog, but in that early mission statement, it said the Blue Dogs were going to come together. They're going to set aside partisan politics in the pursuit of the common good. And I think that they meant that both in regards to the common good of the country, but also each member's district. And this idea that you come to Washington as representatives first and foremost, and when you're all working together, trying to take care of each other in these local interests, that's also going to result in the best kind of politics coming out of Congress, and lead to a good politics for the country. And as Marie came on and joined the Blue Dogs, and we've spent a lot of time talking about what is the future of the Blue Dogs, we kept coming back to this idea of localism, or a very local focus. I think that there's a lot of issues out there, sure, that have to be almost solely in the wheelhouse of the federal government. But there's so many, actually, where we think the Democratic Party has what might best be described as like a venue problem, where we're trying to solve it all from Washington and not thinking about how do we go about trying to solve issues at the local level, like trying to empower the most local form of government, whether that's like a town, committee, or, in the states. And, I guess with that in mind, just being really wonky and interested about very local issues. People will get very excited, like we all are guilty of it, talking about the high-level political issues, and we want to then go and have these conversations about how do we turn this into an agenda that will excite people. But I find that the people I represent and the things that I get really excited about often are so local, so locally focused that maybe it'll make your eyes glaze over. But to me, like that is the stuff that can excite a very broad, piece of your constituency and make them feel like you're there representing them for the right reasons. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but like Marie and I will spend hours talking about things like, well, there was her banana bill last Congress. I can talk about regulations coming out of federal laws.
Yeah, well, can I ask you about something that I've heard about from your constituents, which was this long fight with the Biden administration about lobstering regulations?
Yes.
Because I think this is an important, obviously this is not that important to most people who aren't New England coastal people, but it's very important in your district. And I think an example of a kind of a cavalier approach coming out of Washington.
Yeah, just today in the Natural Resources Committee, I had a constituent testifying in front of the committee, and we were talking about right whale regulations and how that's impacting the fishermen. Like at the national level, I would say, like, you've all heard stories about towns that have lost, like, mills, manufacturing jobs, and, like, the town hollows out, and it's devastating to a community. When I think about the same thing, like if the lobster communities were shut down and couldn't fish anymore, it's not just that those communities would die kind of a slow death, but to me, even more sinister is that there's all kinds of people, I kid you not, they're waiting for it to happen. Like there are town managers on the coast in my district who get phone calls when there's news stories about regulations might put the lobstermen out of business, and they're calling and they're saying, hey, we've got a bunch of people that want to buy property. Like, don't worry, like we'll turn this into a huge tourist attraction. It's gonna be great for you in your town. That should resonate, I think, with Democrats, particularly as we're talking about defending working class communities. But like, we were talking about fish stock assessments today, and I get like very into it. And basically, NOAA often excludes the fishermen from the process whatsoever, and that's wild to me because like the guy testifying today, he's in his 30s. He fished for 20 years, but he has 4 generations of fishing knowledge and wisdom standing behind him. And the fishermen will say, like, look, we've got piles upon piles of like logbooks about where to find fish, how to go about catching fish, and the scientists at NOAA are basically, I think, I don't want to be like too critical, but they just exclude that. It's not allowed into the process, and they're just kind of using like formulas, computers, AI, and all this type of stuff. So to me, like, this is a discussion about localism, I suppose, but it's also what gets me really motivated.
Yeah.
I think what animates me on this, or like illustrates it very clearly for me, like when I was running for my first reelect, I was getting all these calls from national journalists who kept asking me about whether or not I was going to endorse Harris. And I was like, I was on an RV tour of my district because it's pretty big. and doing all these town halls all over, and like no one in these fucking town halls is asking me about Harris. They want to talk about sea lion predation on salmons. Like that's the reality. Like what is useful and kind of turning. Like when I used to pull cars in the shop, like 8 out of 10 times the radio would be on news, and now it's like 1 out of 10 times. Like politics has become irrelevant to most people because it has excluded the things that touch their life. It feels very abstract. Like, and the way it is about making politics more relevant to more people and demonstrating the utility of policy to advance, the economic sovereignty of my community. That is what like localism illustrates to me. Like it's pointing out the sort of Venn diagram of where federal policy has failed to account for the nuance of local experience.
But to push back, not to disagree, but part of what you're doing, right? You're focusing on local, you're focusing on what's concrete, on what's important to people, but you are also on certain big national issues, like on the SAVE Act recently, right? Like you cast a vote that your constituents agreed with on like a big high-profile topic, even though there's a lot of national advocacy pressuring you in the other direction.
Sure, I mean, I would warn, I guess, that it's like an 80-20 issue in my district. I mean, you can look at the results of the election in Wisconsin recently, where we saw our side prevail in the court, in the election of the Supreme Court justice, but that same electorate voted for voter ID by, I think, over 70% of the vote. And I would just say that, at least in Maine, and this is true in Maine, so don't apply it broadly across like 49 other states, but in Maine, if you dig into it, all roads eventually lead to having to meet almost all of the requirements of the SAVE Act in order to register the vote for the first time. It's not explicitly written into law, but in practice, there's pretty much no real way around it.
Yeah.
So in other words, if that became law federally, it would practically change next to nothing in Maine.
Interesting. So, Congressman Gray, what do you think, what does it take to get more people like you winning nominations in frontline seats and being supported? I mean, what can people here do as a community to help sort of replicate and recruit and grow these kind of caucuses?
Well, I think we have to create a support network, organization where voters, organizers, and communities across the country are being very intentional about, I'm only going to support a candidate who meets this metric, who is focused on local issues or representative democracy, who's not going to just fall into a cookie cutter version of one of the two parties, right? Which there's enormous pressure to fit into that mold, not on just these high profile votes like the SAVE Act or some others, but you see it back in Washington every single day where there's a constant discussion of messaging, as if there's some message that fits perfectly into all of our districts. Each district is unique, and I think what we really need is to be the party that welcomes diversity of every kind, including ideological diversity, under its Big Tent, right? With a healthy focus on what Jerry and Marie were just calling localism, but this notion. I mean, every single time I run for office, I highlight water as a major issue in my district. And every single political consultant who I've ever worked with tells me how that's not important and nobody cares. And then we do a focus group, and every one of them apologizes to me and says, oh, well, this is the first district I've ever seen where folks are interested. And it's like, well, when you've got a district full of people who make a living off of agriculture, that's an extraordinarily important policy that impacts lives in a real way. And that's a focus on something that's not broadly across the country. So I think we've got to create space. And what people can do is be part of the army that's elbowing to create that space, because there are certainly a whole group of people who are trying to force everyone into the same mold. And you see it through the pressure, at the Capitol, through our political party system, at the party conventions. And rather than making things broad and open and appealing to the widest set of people, we we set up our parties in a way that's actually very unappealing and has a small segment of that population trying to scrutinize or hold accountable to a very narrow lens of the world and of how we solve our problems in it.
So it sets us up nicely. You've got the Blue Dog cap on right now, so you're waving the flag. When you have a caucus whose idea is to sort of broaden the tent, I mean, how do you think about what defines a blue dog then, in that sense? Like how big is the tent within the big tent?
Well, I think people are profoundly heterodox. Like, if you actually talk to normal people, like the same person who has pretty left views on trans rights will also be very fiercely Second Amendment. And I think allowing for that heterodox and allowing people, like, respecting and reflecting, and I think, like, we are a small caucus. There's 10 of us, but I would argue that, like, most Americans are blue dogs. Like, we are a plurality of actual Americans in the sense of, like, our demand for economic agency, the kind of nuts and bolts of, like, antitrust. Can I fix my own shit? Can I sell my chickens to who I want to? Do people have a right to make decisions that make sense in their communities, in their life? And I think the definition of a blue dog is somebody that is putting like their soil, like their land, their community above partisanship. And I think taking that lens of, like, what are we actually arguing about here, and is the argument worth winning, and what do you get if you win? And I think it is a question of, are you trying to be somebody that is absolutely technically correct and vetted, your opinions are vetted and approved by the think tanks and more establishment, or are you trying to make people's lives better? Because you get to pick one.
Mm-hmm. Look, I think we're kind of a little bit right now anyways in the posture of like a loyal opposition, and trying to remind folks about certain things that the party used to know were true, but just kind of ignore right now. So, similar to Adam talking about advice from pollsters or consultants, for a long time I was telling people, like, I don't know, but, like, back home, like, my general sense is that people are worried about the deficit and our national debt, and I just hear all the time down here, like, no, people don't care about that, or at the very least, they're not willing to make any kind of trade-offs to address it. And, I threw some polling in, and I was telling people, I think it was last year or maybe the cycle before that, that one of the strongest polling messages we had was not just tax the rich, but tax the rich to reduce the deficit. And I think David Shore showed in one of his little graphs breaking down, like, the kind of top issues and the trust gap that our party is suffering from, that in fact, like, his data shows, the American people are very concerned about the debt and the deficit, and that's just something that Blue Dogs have been talking about for a long time.
Like, rich people don't have to worry about the debt. Like, they don't experience debt. Like, if you actually are working in this country, you understand how bitter it is to carry interest on a credit card. Like, we don't need to be educated about debt. Like, we understand quite clearly what it means, how your hands are tied, how your children's opportunities are limited by debt. And I think.
Well, doing things too that candidates don't think they can do on this topic. I remember when I was running, and I won the closest race in the country, 187 votes. And I think I was the only Democrat in the country to actually beat an incumbent Republican in a district that Trump won. Mm-hmm. And I think authenticity is a really important X factor. And I would go to these fundraising events with oftentimes a really liberal constituency, right, that was giving money for the sole purpose of Democrats taking the House back. And my ideological views didn't necessarily fit neatly with their ideological views. And you'd see staff and consultants and others get kind of hair on fire and upset when I would explain who I am, what my background is, what my views are. And I would oftentimes describe myself as I was the most conservative Democrat in the state legislature for a decade in California. And here's my views on public safety, here's my views on this, here's my views on that, and that's why I'm going to win. But inevitably, some of those donors who all the staff and consultants said, oh, you can't talk like that, would come up to me after the event and say, you know, it's so refreshing to meet somebody who actually says what they mean, who's running for office, right? And so I just think we need to tap into authenticity, which I think connects to this idea, you know, if you're focused on local issues and being authentic to your community, you're gonna be successful. And we all have a role to play in making that more doable for candidates, right? And not only more doable, but encouraging. I mean, we should have the same passion with this group and folks that are in attendance, these organizations here, that Emily's list has about electing women, or other interest groups have a passion about electing a certain type of candidate, veterans or whatever. Well, we ought to have that kind of passion about people that are centrist and authentic and willing to break the mold.
Yeah, I think my readers sent about $50,000 your way, and that's because, you know, I've been trying to cultivate, you know, a base of people who appreciate that, and just say to people who are moderately minded, because I think a lot of folks who are in the middle sort of tune politics out and just let extreme people be engaged, but the only way to, it's like, you know, everybody's got to roll up their sleeves and do their part. I want to ask you about contentiousness, Marie. Because I watched a couple focus groups of crossover voters in your district, Trump voters who voted for you. And they all started talking about how you're independent-minded, and the example that came up was that you'd broken with Democrats over student loan relief type stuff. And I think these were people who they weren't like obsessed with politics. You know, you could tell they didn't like know that much about it, but they'd heard about this and they liked it and they admired it. And I feel like a lot of your colleagues, even when they may be inclined to be more to the middle, like shy away from ever sort of having those fights. And I just wonder, I mean, what's your experience? Because I know, like, people yell at you, people get mad at you, they say you're like lying about bananas. So, like, I mean, how does it go?
I think it's like who you're listening to. Like, everybody has the right to have their voice heard. But just because you have a bigger microphone doesn't mean that you have a bigger voice, you know, that you should have a bigger say in how policy is built. And so I think, you know, it's like if you can like financially afford to go to a protest every day, you are inherently a very different person than most of my community. Mm-hmm. And I think that recognizing that, like, your ability to be involved in politics, you know, I mean, I never went to these meetings and things. Like, I was running a shop, like, you know, but that doesn't mean that I'm not, I don't have opinions. And so I think I balance, you know, it's like, what do people say to me at the grocery store? What do people say to me at daycare drop-off? What do they say to me at church? Like, a broader sample of what my community thinks and what my mom thinks, you know? And it's like, you know, the kind of, the people that are quite loud and you know, feel very, you know, I guess, self-assured that their voice is the correct voice. It's like, on whose behalf are you speaking? Mm-hmm. That's the thing that I think about.
How's your local Indivisible chapter?
Yes.
I heard that came up earlier. I'll just say, like, it's not, so Marie and I voted against the President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan, right? And it's not that we're necessarily opposed to helping people with their college debt load across the board. Like, the details really matter. And when you looked at that plan when it was rolled out, like, the data doesn't lie. It was regressive. Like, the people who are going to benefit most were largely coming from upper middle class, more affluent or very wealthy households, often people pursuing master's degree programs or, you know, just graduate level, you know, degrees. And it's just like, do we really have to bring it all the way there? And some people would say yes, because I actually believe that almost all of our programming should be universal. You know, it's like the same, like, electric vehicle tax credits. Like, if you're making $300,000, $500,000, like, I'm sorry, but you can go buy your electric vehicle. You don't need a tax credit. You don't need help with that. You can afford it all by yourself. And I think we just care about like those details and how we apply it as Democrats to who exactly needs help and who are we seeking to represent here. So, look, the local indivisibles are not, I don't have any problem with them. In fact, I know many of them, and I've had a years-long dialogue with many of them, myself and my staff. Like, we've given them a lot of time. It's the national group, and you know, when I hear about what Indivisible's trying to do, kind of from my constituents who are part of those local groups, it's kind of like we're trying to bring the country together. But when you read like the documents of the National Indivisible Group, like they spell it right out as plain as day, that they're coming after Blue Dogs and New Dems. And their goal is to divide the Democratic coalition until it is 100% in the image of the Progressive Caucus. So, you know, I actually don't think that's the goal of a lot of the people in the local Indivisible group. So like my issue is not with them, but rather the national entity, which, yeah, they're not taking like marching orders per se, but like they are receiving a whole lot of very misleading information about specific votes or just issues in general about myself and other Democrats down here in Washington that's being pushed by a hyper national organization with a very single-minded agenda.
I was just going to add to that I think we talk about elitism a lot in the Democratic Party, and we throw around a lot of terms, but functionally, I remember after both the 22 and the 24 election, being in the room with some of my Democrat colleagues and having them kind of have this discussion about we got to do a better job of explaining to people what we did for them. And my initial recoil at hearing that is like, well, if you have to explain to somebody what you did for them, you probably didn't really do much for them. Right? They would know if you did something for them. And I just think there's a real problem with that. And all of these groups, whether it's Indivisible or the Democratic Party or any other organization, tend to get controlled by a small number of folks with a very narrow set of views.
So, I think most of the leaders of the Democratic Party are from big cities. And I think even in this room, where you have people who are blue dog appreciators, who are pragmatists, who are centrists, it's still a lot of people from urban areas. And so I think when Richie Torres or Jake Auchincloss comes in here, they're talking about a lot of stuff that instinctively resonates with us and with our kind of local problems. But what do we need to understand? What do Welcome Pack people need to understand about rural America?
That rural America has been treated like an internal resource colony in this nation, that we are really tired of having our kids feel like they have to move to LA or New York to be successful, that the ways and the things that we value are worth having, that they are not things that you get out of a textbook, that they come from cultural knowledge and deep roots, and we're unapologetic, and we don't hate you. We also just are tired of, we're tired of being ignored and being an afterthought.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I remember some years ago, the Attorney General in California was running for U.S. Senate, and she came through the Central Valley where I live, and we met with a bunch of farmers and growers, and we went around the room, and every single person in the room described themselves as a small family farmer. And I got to speak last, and I said, Madam Attorney General, with all due respect to my friends here who all describe themselves as small family farmers, some of them are pretty big family farmers. I said, but we have to apologize about our success. Don't call it big Hollywood or big this, but other people can celebrate their success, but in rural community we have to apologize for it. And I just think there is a chip on our shoulder from being either talked down to, explained to, or just ignored by politics, and it's challenging, right? Because urban areas have more voters, there's naturally more attention. I mean, those are kind of the natural setup of democracy, but I think the fact that Bill Clinton was the last Democratic president to win a majority of rural counties is a major problem for our party, and one that we ought to be hyper-focused on.
All right, thank you all so much.
I didn't mean to eat up all the lot.
Welcoming to the stage, David Shore.
All right, let me just do the mic check. Sorry, mics always give me a little bit of trouble. All right, so I'm just gonna start. All right. So, very excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me. At the top, I just want to express some gratitude for the folks, my coworkers at Blue Rose. I come up and I give the talks, but there's actually a whole team of people who work very hard to make all these graphs, so I just want to give a shout out to them. So, thank you. So, the first thing that I'm going to talk about is here we have a table that shows presidential vote in 2016, 2020, and 2024 by race and ideology. And there's two things I want to point out here. The first is that broken out this way, that if you look at 2016 to 2020, to 2024, there was basically no change among white voters. Basically, the entirety of the 2016 to 2024 shift, which was enormous. We went from getting 51.1% of the popular vote to getting 49.2%, was entirely because of declines among non-white voters, and in particular, non-white, moderate, and conservative voters. The other thing I want to point out here is just that if you look at these two swing columns, you'll see that this is pretty correlated. And that the point here is just that these trends weren't an aberration. They've been happening continuously ever since Trump entered the national stage. But a trend that is new is basically that we've seen enormous polarization by political engagement. If you look at basically the chart on the right-hand side, what you can see is that over here, on the x-axis, we have how politically engaged a precinct is, and we measure that by what percentage of the people in that precinct voted in 2022. And on the y-axis, we have change in Democratic vote share from 2020 to 2024. And what you can see is that in the very most engaged precincts in the country, Kamala Harris actually did better than Joe Biden did. But the flip side is if you look at the least engaged precincts, those precincts swung against Democrats by very large margins. This has overturned a decades-long truism in Democratic politics that when everyone votes, we win. If last year only 2022 voters had voted, which to be clear, 2022 was not a very good cycle for Democrats, had that happened, Kamala Harris would have won the popular vote and the Electoral College. But the flip side is that if everyone had voted, Donald Trump would have won with the largest popular vote majority since George H.W. Bush in 1988. So here we have a plot that breaks out Kamala Harris support in 2024 by age, race, and gender. And the two things I want to highlight here are that first, if you look at voters who are under 25, all race and gender groups were more conservative than the millennials who were immediately before them. Shout out to the millennials. But the other thing is that this negative trend was not even by gender. The gender gap in American politics by age, this is just the difference in how much more Democratic are women than men, has been mostly stable since the 1990s, which is when Democrats started to do better with women than men. But if you look at voters who were under the age of 30, that gap doubled in size over the past 4 years. This is happening in other countries, but I think it's just worth saying. I've never seen anything like this in American politics before. I think a lot of people have talked about the young men problem in American politics, but I think it's still somehow underrated because it's still because of just how bad the numbers are. Just to go back here for a second, if 18-year-old white men were a state, their closest state would be Wyoming. And if you look at 18-year-old non-white men, Donald Trump narrowly won them by a point. So, just to close out the postmortem a little bit, here we have a graph from The Economist where the x-axis is the percentage of residents who are foreign-born, and the y-axis is the change in vote share, from 2020 to 2024. And what you could see is that the most immigrant-heavy counties, like my home county, Miami-Dade, or Queens in New York, swung toward Republicans at enormous margins. And if you carry that forward to a precinct level, you can see that Donald Trump, that areas of the country that have been Democratic strongholds for decades, like Chinatown and the Lower East Side, or Corona and Queens, Donald Trump won. And, and so our best guess is that immigrants have switched from being, naturalized citizens, who, to be clear, are about 10% of the electorate, went from being a group that Joe Biden won by 27 points to becoming a group that Donald Trump narrowly won by 1 point. So now to talk a little bit about the how. So the first thing here, and I think this is a simple plot. This is just showing how popular the Democratic and Republican presidential candidates were in 2020 and 2024. It's simple, but it's very important, just for understanding what's going on. Basically, from 2020 to 2024, Trump and the Republican Party were roughly as popular in both years. The only thing that changed is that Joe Biden had a +6 net favorable rating in 2020, and Kamala Harris had a -6 favorability rating in 2024. And I'm not saying that, to beat up on Kamala Harris. Joe Biden's favorables in 2024 were a lot worse. But I just want to highlight, the thing that changed is that Democrats went from being popular to being unpopular. And I think the most straightforward explanation for why is that voters saw the Biden administration as a failed presidency. After Afghanistan and the cost of living increases and the fights over the budget, Joe Biden quickly settled into being one of the most unpopular presidents in American history and stayed at that level really for the rest of his presidency. Joe Biden ended his term more unpopular than Donald Trump was immediately after January 6th. It's a true fact. Yeah. And so, just to understand, I think another angle for understanding this election is here we did 2 polling questions. The first is we just asked, what's more important right now? Preserving America's institutions or delivering change that improves people's lives? And delivering change, won 78 to 18. I think that's a little bit of a loaded polling question, I'll admit. But the next one, I think, is actually a lot more fair. We asked people to choose between things are going well in America, things could be going better, but what we need is a return to basic stability, and things in America are going poorly. And what's needed is a major change and a shock to the system from whoever becomes president. And when you ask it this way, shock to the system won 53 to 37, and only 3% of voters thought things were going well. And I think, unfortunately, the American people got what they voted for. Another way to look at this is to just ask voters, basic ideological placement. And here we just ask voters, is Kamala Harris more liberal than you, more conservative than you, or close to my views? And we did the same for Donald Trump. And when you do things this way, 49% of voters thought that Kamala Harris was more liberal than them, while only 39% of voters thought that Donald Trump was more conservative than them. The flip side is that only 7% of the electorate thought that Kamala Harris was too liberal, even though that is most of my friends. Yeah. So, I think when you actually go and ask, the way that we like to measure how important voters find an issue is that we show people 2 issues and we just say, what is more important? And, I think it's really impossible to overstate how much voters cared about the cost of living in the last election. When you put cost of living up against another issue at random, people picked cost of living 91% of the time. It's really hard to get 91% of survey takers to pick anything. So now I just want to spend a lot of time on this slide because I think it basically tells the story of this election. We like to break out issues into two dimensions: how important voters find an issue, and then how much people trust Democrats on this issue relative to Republicans. Our theory of change is that you should try to talk to people about issues that voters care about, and hopefully issues that voters trust us on. Though unfortunately right now there are very few issues where we have both. When you look at all of the issues that voters cared about on Election Day, cost of living, the economy, taxes, government spending, the deficit, Republicans had +10 or +15 leads on most of these issues, with the only bright spot for Democrats being a narrow 1-point lead on healthcare. The basic strategic problem that Democrats faced this cycle was that they had a massive trust deficit on nearly all of the issues that voters cared the most about. When you look at the things we did have trust advantages on, reproductive rights or the environment, they simply didn't rank very highly on voters' minds. I think when I look at this plot, I think it really highlights the extent to which we really are lucky that we only lost by a point. It's really only singularly because Donald Trump is such an unlikable person that, we did not lose by 10 or 15 percentage points when 58% of the country trusts Republicans more than Democrats on the economy. So, I just wanted to, I wanted to have, I just wanted to talk here. I think it's become very fashionable, maybe not in this room, but in Democratic politics, to espouse a certain kind of nihilism. That there are no swing voters, that all that matters is mobilizing the base, and that what we say and do doesn't matter. And I think that's just a crazy thing to believe if you actually look at the election results. Here we have Kamala Harris vote and Democratic Senate vote share by state, and you can see that even though these elections happened on the same day and featured the exact same set of voters, there was dramatic variation. And that candidates who had better ads and showed better discipline and focused on issues that voters cared about did better. And I think, there's no point in denying that. And so, to talk a little bit about the present, here we've gone through and we've polled, I'd say maybe hundreds of different Trump policy proposals. And the reality is that some of them are popular and some of them are unpopular. But I think, we shouldn't be too despondent. The reality is if you look at some of these unpopular things, that's what's in the news right now. They are, not actually doing popularism. Just to close this out, I wanted to end on some of the most popular ads, the most effective ads last cycle. The first was here we have an ad by Kamala Harris where she looks directly to the camera and says, the cost of rent, groceries, and utilities is too high. And then we have another one, which attacks Donald Trump for tariffs. I think that all of these things, the policy polling, the testing, the trust, all point to a really coherent picture that, the way that we win is just by focusing on the things that voters care about. And, with that, I'll end there. And now I'll call Senator Slotkin.
Yeah, the most formal introduction I've ever had. And there's Senator Slotkin. How we doing? Great.
Hello? There we go. All right, sick. All right. Very honored to have you.
Happy to be here.
It's actually very rare for pollsters to get to interview elected officials, so very excited about that. So I'll just jump immediately to my first question,
okay.
Which is, I wanted to, say up front that I think your electoral record is very impressive. And I think it's a really natural question to ask about why is it that you did so well. And I feel like normally, I've seen politicians get asked this question a lot, and they say, I went to every county, I knocked on the doors, I listened to the voters. But I think it's just an interesting thing. There were hundreds of Democrats who ran in federal races that in geographies or districts that Trump won, and almost all of them lost. And you are one of like 6 or 7 out of like 300 that won. And so I kind of wanted to get you off your stump a little bit and talk shop. And so I guess what I want to know is, I think in order to perform, especially in a presidential year, I think you really had to get attention. And so I'm just really curious, how you and your campaign managed to get attention to yourself, especially when the media environment was so crowded.
Well, thanks for having me. I mean, I think it was a couple of things. First of all, I do think if you go back and look at our ads, there are two things that really stuck out. One, we talked ruthlessly about the economy, and it ended up being an economy election. And then pretty much every single one of my ads was direct to camera. And it was just me saying, look, I don't really care what kind of car you drive. I want to make them in Michigan, electric, combustion, the whole thing. And I think that thank you for the one guy clapping. This is Democratic room, so. But I think topic I think is important, but I also think, at least in Michigan, I've been talking about this a little bit, I think there's a substance issue for Democrats, but there's also a style thing. And that alpha energy, we have just sort of lost some alpha energy, and I have maybe a few ounces more of that than the average Democrat. Sure. And that in a place like the Midwest, where our idols are the coaches of our professional teams and people who really command, I think that was really important. And then I think, just being honest, I think after 20 years of reality television, the average consumer of media can totally tell when someone is putting out a line. And so even though I say more ums and I don't speak as perfectly maybe as some really, really polished politicians, we feel strongly that that's just being a normal person. Being on Team Normal right now really helps. We need more normal. We'll go normal.
Well, I'm just excited to hear. The electric car thing, I think, is really underrated. Voters, that's one of the things that, with a lot of my polling, I think it'll be people don't like defund the police. That's not that surprising. But voters really hate electric cars, or they have very strong feelings. That was surprising to me. Okay, so.
To be clear, they don't hate electric vehicles.
Right.
They just don't want to be told they have to drive an electric vehicle, particularly when the infrastructure hasn't kept pace with need. So I can't drive from my house to Chicago. I can't drive from Michigan to Chicago, which is a very common route for a lot of people, easily and seamlessly in an electric vehicle. One day I think I will be. And then there's an economic competitiveness that is real about the price of gas. But until then, right? And I have a brother that has an electric vehicle, and he lives in St. Louis. And just watching what he has to do to drive home to Michigan, there is a fly in this situation. Sorry if I'm not swatting at David. I just think people want practicality. They want something that works and makes their life easier, not harder, and that's what I'm for. I'm not against electric vehicles. I'm against forcing someone to buy one.
Right, and one of my good friends likes to say, it's Ford's job to sell electric cars. Yeah. It's not yours. Okay, so the next question I just wanted to ask is, in this kind of conference circuit, a lot of people talk about improving the Democratic Party brand, and it gets very amorphous and theoretical. And I'm just curious, to you as an elected official who's talked to way more swing voters than I have, what are some concrete things party leadership or the liberal media or whatever could do for you that would make your life easier, or they could do more broadly?
So I think in general, if we use the analogy of an NFL team, or if you're using a military example, you got to play defense and offense. And I think it's very clear that Trump has thrown us onto our heels. He's flooded the zone. We haven't totally gotten our defense together, and we're a little thin on offense. And so I think that, to me, is something, that vision piece is something that the Democratic Party deeply needs. We know we don't like what Trump's doing, But we can't just like defend everything as it is, because the election was a signal to us, not just to Republicans, but to everyone, that people aren't happy with what they have from their government. They're not. So we need to own that, hear that, and then say, here's the vision that we have. And I think one of the things I took from after I did the State of the Union response and then did a bunch of media was like, I'm not going to sit in another room with another group of Democrats and then have them say, what's the plan? And be like, well, we're working on it. And so out of desperation, I literally wrote like a 17-page PowerPoint war plan. And then now we need the vision piece. You can't win someone over by being like, I hate that guy. That's not a persuasive argument. And it may feel good, but it's not enough for swing voters.
Oh, well,
So there's one guy who's a big fan here. Thank you.
More than one, So can you tell me more about the war plan? What is this positive vision for the economy?
So I think, look, I come from a national security background, and so it's hard to take those glasses off when you've been trained your whole life to think that way. And to me, there are complicated adversaries out there. That doesn't mean you don't plan and come up with a way forward. So first you got to figure out, what are you really trying to do, right? There's a million things that Trump is doing, or there's a million things that are presented in a bill that are a problem. How do you prioritize ruthlessly on what you really care about? And so things like winning a Supreme Court case on the issue of separation of powers, forcing Trump to actually enforce a court order from the Supreme Court, winning in 26, winning back the House, winning in 28, right? When bringing those primary candidates out for some airing out early. And to me, you gotta be ruthless about those priorities. What does it mean to win or contain Donald Trump? And then a huge part of that is offering something different. So my theory of the case, and I'm sure you've heard it a million times in different ways today, is like, it is not, you've seen it in your polling, it is not a political opinion that it's harder to get in and stay in the middle class. And if you're from a place like Michigan, where we invented the middle class, where you could work in an auto plant and afford the car you were building, then you're doing worse than your dad and your granddad. I live in a place I live on my farm. I've never won my town. I've never won my precinct. I've never won my neighbors. My town supervisor was my guest at Trump's inauguration because he's such a fanboy, and when I called to offer him the ticket, he started crying. So I live in that, and people in my town are often doing worse than their parents and their grandparents, and it makes you feel shame, and it makes you feel humiliated, and you start looking for someone or something to blame, and that's often someone who doesn't look like you or doesn't sound like you. So to me, the central theory of the case in the Democratic vision is we've got to expand and protect the middle class. That's what I think we're about. And how we do that is the entire game. Because if we don't have a strong middle class, we are screwed as a country, totally screwed.
Well, it does. I guess I'm just curious. Like, protecting the middle class, it sounds great. How much detail do you think we need to get into? Because presumably, your neighbors also, they don't want tax increases. They're probably not super interested in like a lot of the programs. Like when I think as a liberal, help the middle class, I'm like, childcare or college subsidies. And so how much detail do you think we have to get into versus how much should we just kind of talk about our goals?
Yeah, I don't know if it is something that you have presented or someone else presented, but it really sort of crystallized for me that often Republicans are talking about vision and about the world that they want, and not the 18 paragraph, policy treatise on how to get there. And now the truth is a lot of what they say has zero policy behind it. But sometimes Democrats are just the wonky policy and none of the emotion and vision and talk to people's hearts. And so we have good policy, but if people don't feel moved by it, then it's not compelling. And so I think that to me it's how we communicate. We're about to go through radical change as a society with technology. I mean radical. AI is gonna do more than the internet did to change our economy, which is a lot. And people don't know how to think about that. They don't know what their kids are going to do in the future. Speak to those fears and those hopes. What should we be doing to prepare? We know our education system isn't working. We know our healthcare system isn't working. We don't have to hide about that, but talk about what we want it to look like. And then, yes, you have the policy undergirding, but you don't have to go straight to the wonky policy with like no heart and no grit. You know, just speak about what you passionately want for your fellow man, and then make sure the policy isn't bonkers. Yeah.
Do you have any? Do you have any favorite bonkers policies, that you've been at?
I mean, we're reviewing the big, beautiful bill right now, and then the budget that came with it. I think there are so many contradictions in, Trump says that he wants to lead the world in innovation, but he's slashing National Science Foundation, NIH, CDC. He's upset about, and rightfully, about this University of Michigan Chinese national who was caught bringing in like basically a bioweapon, an ag bioweapon, but won't do anything, like is now cutting our cybersecurity that protects all our infrastructure. Like the contradictions are everywhere. But the problem is it's put Democrats into a posture of just defending the status quo. But if you're my neighbors, you don't think the status quo is good. So why are we just, and it's not good. I was at the Pentagon, I was at the CIA before there. If you had come to me in the Pentagon and been like, you've got to cut 10% of your workforce, I'm like, great, I know exactly where I'll start, right? There's dead weight in the government. It's too hard to fire people who aren't performing. You don't have to hide about that. The way Doge is doing it is the dumbest, most astrategic way to do things, but I don't disagree with the concept that we need government to do different things. So we got to figure out a way to talk about that, and don't hide from that. Don't like meekly, with our book reading hands, like make it an analytic problem. Like own that. Okay, big fan up here.
So I guess really the last question I have for you is, we have a lot of time, so So it means answer fully. But I guess the thing I like to ask politicians is just what lessons generally from the last election? You talk to donors, you talk to elites, to people in the Senate. What lessons from the election have you gleaned that you think people in the party haven't really absorbed yet?
Well, I'll just start with the premise of the question that like we had a bad election, and I should go and talk to insiders and elites and donors to figure out what happened. Honestly, the people on the ground in Michigan will tell you exactly what happened. Okay, and it's just they would say at the doors, I really don't like Donald Trump. He kind of exhausts me, but I think he's going to put more money in my pocket. Like his yard signs were like, Harris, higher taxes. Trump, lower taxes. Like Harris, higher grocery bill. Trump, lower grocery bill. Like they were his blunt face, and so I think they will. And I think the larger story is that the middle class is shrinking, and we don't know what to do about that. Right? But in terms of like tactically, I thought about this a little bit. One of the best things we ever did, and you'll appreciate this as a data person, was actually forced by COVID. So during COVID, people who are in competitive elections, we do polling, and when we do focus groups, okay? But then we had COVID, and you couldn't get people together in the same room. So we went to online, meaning Zoom focus groups, and then live chat focus groups where you don't even see each other. And we never went back to in-person focus groups, because it turns out when you get a bunch of people in to a fancy ballroom, conference room in a hotel with a nice college-educated facilitator who will maybe look down on them depending on their answers, they really get into groupthink. So I knew we had something much more raw, much more real, much more accurate when we went to one of these live chat ones. So people are at home, they're watching a screen, and they can chat in. And so we showed them a bunch of my commercials and videos and everything, and we're like, okay, what's your reaction? And of course, I'm like watching silently. And the first guy's like, ... And he's like, I just don't know about this whole women in politics thing. That was his first reaction. I'm like, now we're getting to it, right? That guy's not gonna say that in a room full of other people. But the privacy of a voting booth is as personal and raw as it gets. So I wanna know what he's thinking in his living room, not in some like sort of facilitated kind of odd experience. So we never went back. By the way, they're cheaper, or they should be for all you people out there. They're cheaper and they're just more accurate. And so I want people to give me the raw, unfiltered. That to me is definitely a lesson. And then I think, you start to understand that at least in a place like the Midwest, there's still nothing beats having a deep local knowledge of your state. And you can't run campaigns. I love all our consultants, but you have to combine all the good things that come from good political advice from local knowledge. So I'll give you a perfect example, and my team will attest to this. I was up last week, we were back in Michigan, and I went to go see a sea lamprey research facility. If you don't know what a sea lamprey is, Google it, it's disgusting. It's basically like a giant eel with a ton of teeth and a pointy tongue that attaches onto fish. It's an invasive species, and it kills the fish by sucking its guts out of it, okay? It's gross. It's super gross. I knew that when I looked at these things, like, I want money to protect against invasive species. I don't like the cuts that are going on. So I know my Michiganders, Democrats and Republicans, care about the Great Lakes. And the researcher said, if you spit into the tank, it makes them swarm. And it's a bunch of eels. It's gross. Yeah, it's gross. And so I'm like, Michiganders are gonna love this shit. And so I spit into the thing, the eels swarm, and we caught it on video, and I told my team, I'm like, that video is gonna be one of our most popular videos. And we put it out late last week, it's 400,000 views for us. And it's because, I said, this is what's gonna happen if we don't protect against invasive species. Do you wanna go to the beach and have all these gross lampreys all over you? So you gotta know your local community in a very deep way. And that, it does come from going everywhere. That does come from, I see a lot of candidates now who think that they can run a digital campaign. God bless you. Maybe in your part of the country you can, not in my state, right? Not in a place where, my old congressional district, 9% of my district was on Twitter, right? Over 60% of Michiganders don't have a news app on their phone and they consume no news, okay? So go do your political digital thing. It's just not the way you win, at least in a swing state.
Couldn't agree more. So, the thing I'm curious about is, you've been in politics now for a decent amount of time. What's the thing that you're most surprised by, that would have surprised you the most if you went back in a time machine to, right before you decided to run? What surprised you actually being in the political system relative to what you thought before?
I still feel like I'm having a cultural adjustment coming from the military and CIA world into politics. I got that my first week when I showed up as a congresswoman. The meeting started at noon. I was there at 5 to noon. Everyone showed up at 12:30. There's some cultural things immediately. I think the thing that we need to grapple with in general is that if you do a side-by-side comparison of the organizational chart of Republican organizations and donors and then Democrats, it's a completely different org chart. We are like stars and planets in a solar system with no sun. There's not a chain of command. There's not someone being like, DS, you're gonna do this, D-Trip, you're gonna do this, DNC, you're gonna do this, senators, we need you down this. There's not that coordination, and I don't understand how to win if we don't work together. And it just doesn't, and that goes also for when there's no strong feeling of coordination, then you end up getting in internal fights. Right? This is the same thing we see in the military. When there's not a strong leader in the brigade, different battalions start arguing with each other. Well, no, we're more important. No, we're more important, right? Progressives, moderates, new generation, older folks, like we turn on each other because we don't have the vision and the game plan. And that's, to me, still surprises me every day. Every day.
Well, how have you dealt with that? You know, how have you
Not well. I mean, I think, part of the reason that I'm speaking publicly, I'm doing big events on the war plan and walking people through it, is because, again, I got tired of saying, like, shouldn't someone be putting together a war plan? And just decided to try and do it. And it's the same thing with the vision piece, right? I desperately want there to be someone who just parachutes in with a great plan of how to deal with our changing economy and how we as a party should be approaching the future. But if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to figure it out. And I've been doing all kinds of briefings and talking to people, and I went to like all these AI events just to get my head around it. And I'm going to talk in the next couple of weeks about, okay, like here's my best stab at what our economic vision should be for the Democratic Party, because it may not be perfect, but I'm like sick of saying, well, I really need one. You just, at this point, with our lack of structure, you just got to do it.
I mean, I couldn't agree with that
Thank you,
more.
one guy.
I really appreciate it just because, you know, these discussions can be extremely abstract sometimes, and at some point, you know, it's been 7 months, we have to say something. But what's the reception been, you know, when you've talked both to other moderates in the caucus and then, you know, just from the caucus more broadly?
Yeah, I would say I know we're at a conference of like the centrist, pragmatic, whatever the right label is. I will just say my feeling is that like traditional progressive versus moderate debate that we've largely been having since 2016 is not actually the real fight anymore. It's not the internal squabble. It's really how you answer the following question, okay? Senior leaders, do you believe that Trump's second administration is an existential threat to the country you love? Or do you believe that it's bad, but like Trump won, we'll get through it and things will boomerang on him, so we just need to kind of wait it out? And I'm in camp number one. And the people and how they divide members, it doesn't go along the like moderate versus progressive ideological lines. You know, there are people who are considered moderates who feel really strongly that we need to be treating this as a real problem, existential problem for democracy. And then there are people who have, like, I consider real progressives who are like, I've seen this movie, we just got to let things turn on him. You know, and I think, so I would say, watch for that divide, because that to me is the real debate right now in the party. Do we, like, when something's existential in a Department of Defense context, it means you are required to get your ass in gear to figure this out now. If something is like a concern, well, you watch it, right? So to me, how you answer that question is how we split now in the party.
All right, well, I just want to give you a chance to give some closing remarks before you go.
He has 3:15 left on the clock, so he's giving me this. So I would just say, you know, a couple of things. You know, again, when you think in like a Department of Defense context, it is not okay to just do defense, and it is not okay to just do offense. You have to do both. And I think the same thing goes for Democrats. We have to be able to figure out how to respond to Trump effectively, how to coordinate in a thoughtful way. But we also have to give the future a seat at the table and think about what we want, whether it's for 26, but really 28. And if we do not do both, and some people are really good at defense and not so hot on offense, some people are great at the vision piece. You've had some speakers here. But we gotta be doing both, or else we're having half a conversation. I think part of my plug, I guess, would be we gotta let voices in the caucus in the party who represent the areas that they're from, and we got to give them a little grace if that doesn't fit the perfect definition of what a New York or California Democrat thinks about. And I think that that sounds right in theory, but when it comes down to it, right, when there's an important vote or when there's an issue that comes up, it gets a little judgy, right? It gets a little judgy, and I promise you, I know my state, and I am going to vote on my state's interest, and I'm going to keep that seat Democratic because of it. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you so much for coming. I think that's something we can all applaud. So,
thanks, everybody.
All right, WelcomeFest. Did you guys have fun today? Woo! So now's the really fun part. We get to go to happy hour. So thank you guys for joining us. It's been a blast. We'll see you next year. And happy hour is in the lobby. Thanks so much, guys.